The truth about the Library of Alexandria isn't what you are taught. Flames that shouldn't have existed, scrolls that survived when they were supposed to be ash, and records that contradict the most repeated version of its destruction. Tonight, we'll dig through the forgotten evidence. Ancient catalogues that vanished without explanation. Texts so dangerous they were locked away instead of burned. And scientific works so advanced that later civilizations pretended they never existed. I've spent years collecting these fragments because every clue points to the same unsettling pattern. The most important knowledge wasn't lost, it was removed. But the part that changed everything for me was this. The library didn't fall once. It fell again, and each time someone made sure we remembered the fire, but not what survived it. Let's begin with the mystery that starts it all. The fire that should not have been possible. The moment you step into the chronology of Alexandria's destruction, you realize that the comfortable version, the one suggesting a single fire neatly tied to a single event, falls apart almost immediately. Historians have long noted that the library's end is not one event, but a sequence of ruptures that contradict one another so sharply that the timeline refuses to settle. And this is where your path begins, because nothing about the library's first major crisis behaves the way a clear historical catastrophe should. Ancient writers contradict one another across centuries. Archaeological evidence refuses to match the simplest explanations, and administrative notes from Rome introduce complications that rarely appear in popular retellings. When these threads are laid side by side, the silence surrounding the earliest damage becomes as revealing as the surviving fragments. You'll notice that the first major fact in this block unsettles the common narrative. Ancient accounts describe multiple fires, not a single defining blaze. Classical sources, writing in different eras and under different political pressures, describe damage in the time of Julius Caesar, in later Roman conflicts, and even in 3rd century upheavals. The problem is not merely the number of fires, but the incompatibility of the descriptions. Some writers speak as though the library's holdings were largely intact, long after Caesar's Alexandrian War, while others imply catastrophic loss at that moment. Yet the earliest writers closest to the event disagree not only with later chroniclers, but with each other. This creates a perplexing landscape in which the library appears to be destroyed, then functioning, then destroyed again, as though its history were trapped in a loop of disappearance and resurgence. Scholars point out that no single fire explains the full pattern. Instead, the evidence suggests several separate incidents, some major, others targeted, that accumulated over centuries. Had the library truly been erased in one stroke, these sources would be far easier to reconcile. Instead, the contradictions linger, forcing you to question every assumption about what the burning of the library really means. This tension becomes more pronounced when you encounter the second key fact. Strabo, who lived in Alexandria during the Augustan period, does not mention any catastrophic destruction at all, even though he described the Museion and its scholarly life in detail. This omission challenges the standard assumption that the library suffered total ruin under Caesar. If the institution had been obliterated a few decades earlier, Strabo's silence would be extraordinary. Historians note that Strabo was explicit when something significant had changed in the world he observed. Yet here he writes, as though a functioning scholarly complex still existed. This does not mean he was unaware of damage. Rather, it raises the possibility that the core institution, or at least major components, remained active. Scholars often interpret this silence as evidence that the earliest destruction was partial rather than total, or that the main trauma associated with Caesar's siege struck associated archives rather than the library proper. But even that interpretation cannot fully account for the lack of detail in Strabo's work. You begin to see why modern historians tread carefully. The more closely the evidence is examined, the more the narrative fractures. This is where the third fact complicates the picture further, because archaeological layers in the region show burn patterns that do not fit neatly with the timeline of Caesar's campaign. Excavations in the vicinity of the ancient royal quarter have revealed strata containing ash deposits and collapsed structural materials from different periods, suggesting that fire visited the zone more than once. But the precise dating of these layers does not align with a single sweeping conflagration. Instead, the physical record hints at episodic damage, smaller fires, structural collapses, and later disturbances consistent with urban conflict and unrest. Some layers correspond more plausibly to the 3rd century CE, when Alexandria experienced multiple civil wars and social upheavals. Others might even align with the later conflicts between Roman imperial factions. Archaeologists are cautious, since the ancient royal quarter lies mostly underwater and beneath modern construction, but the fragments recovered refuse to cooperate with narratives rooted in singularity. What emerges is a pattern of recurrent vulnerability rather than a clean, decisive end. You're led toward the unsettling idea that the library's demise may have been a drawn-out erosion, repeatedly interrupted by restoration attempts that never fully recovered what had been lost. Yet, if that were the whole story, it would resolve into an ordinary account of historical confusion. But the 4th and final fact in this block turns the entire picture inside out, because Roman administrative documents point to a surprising conclusion. Far more scrolls appear to have survived into the early imperial period than the standard narrative would suggest. Surviving Roman records concerning copying projects, book exchanges, and scholarly correspondence indicate that Alexandria continued to serve as a major repository of texts long after the supposed destruction. Some administrative exchanges even suggest that the library, or an institution functioning similarly, was supplying materials to Rome, Pergamon, and other centers. These are not hints preserved in obscure marginal notes. They appear in official correspondence and logistical records that track the movement of manuscripts across administrative centers. That would be impossible if the library had already been reduced to ashes. The implication is not that everything survived, but that a significant portion of the collection, or perhaps a reconstituted version supported by the museum, remained operational well after Caesar's time. This directly contradicts later accounts that place total destruction at the feet of a single event, and invites the possibility that some chroniclers retroactively amplified earlier incidents to serve political or ideological ends. When all 4 facts are placed together, they create a landscape of uncertainty that resists collapse into a single explanation. The historical record presents a library that burned, yet continued, that suffered losses, yet persisted, that declined, yet retained influence, that fell victim to multiple moments of violence, yet remained active enough for scholars to complain about missing catalogues and shifting access policies. You're left following a trail in which the absence of evidence becomes evidence itself, evidence of censorship, reconstruction, uneven preservation, and political rewriting. And in that contradictory space, a question emerges. If the library's downfall cannot be pinned to one moment, which disappearance marks the true beginning of its end? That question leads directly to the next investigation, because once the timeline fractures, the search for the culprit becomes far more complicated than the simple story often told. When multiple fires shadow the library's history, deciding who lit the first flame becomes an inquiry not just into physical destruction, but into motives, power, and the political uses of knowledge. And that mismatch, the gap between the popular myth and the tangled historical record, is exactly what opens the door to the next clue. When you move from the fractured timeline of destruction into the question of who ignited the first decisive blow, the ground shifts beneath you again. The popular version tends to place Julius Caesar at the center of everything, as though one commander could shoulder the full responsibility for a cultural loss spanning centuries. Yet when you follow the evidence rather than the myth, the story turns ambiguous, then contradictory, and finally opaque. The closer you look, the harder it becomes to assign a single culprit or even a single moment of intent. And it's here, in that uncertainty, that the motives of empire, the pressures of politics, and the convenience of retrospective blame all start to surface. You start with what feels like a solid foundation, because Caesar himself left extensive commentaries on the Alexandrian War, and these writings are unusually self-serving when he wishes to appear competent or victorious. Yet the first major fact in this block cuts directly against expectations. Caesar never mentions burning the library. His commentary described the chaos of the conflict, the attempt to seize the royal fleet, the fires spreading through the docks, and the necessity of defensive action, but nowhere does he claim, admit, or even hint that the library itself was damaged. Historians note that Caesar was not shy about justifying harsh actions when he believed them strategically necessary. If he had knowingly destroyed a major cultural institution, it would have been well within his rhetorical instincts to frame it as unavoidable or even tactically clever. Instead, the silence is total. This absence forces you to reconsider the assumption that Caesar's troops directly targeted the library or even realized its proximity to the areas engulfed in flame. From here, however, the narrative takes its first sharp turn, because while Caesar is silent, Plutarch, writing much later, does place responsibility on Caesar's forces. This becomes the second key fact shaping the debate. Plutarch's biography of Caesar asserts that the fire set by Roman soldiers spread uncontrollably into parts of the city, destroying valuable collections. Yet when scholars compare his account to other contemporary or near-contemporary sources, they find discrepancies large enough to cast doubt on the precision of his report. Plutarch was concerned with moral character, not forensic reconstruction, and his narratives often emphasize symbolism over strict chronology. The fire in his hands becomes an illustration of Caesar's recklessness or tragic necessity rather than a technically documented military event. Still, his account has influenced centuries of historical imagination, leading many to accept without question that Caesar's actions were the decisive cause. When you consider this disparity, the silence of Caesar himself against the moralized framing of Plutarch, it becomes clear that later interpretations may have overshadowed the messy complexities of the original event. Yet the deeper you go, the less satisfying a single culprit explanation becomes, because earlier Greek sources introduce an entirely different dimension. The third fact in this block draws from Theopompus, whose writings allude to political motives behind attacks on Alexandrian archives, even before Caesar's arrival. While much of his work survives only in fragments and citations, the preserved references point to internal tensions within Egypt and the broader Hellenistic world. Theopompus notes that control over knowledge was inseparable from control over power. Archives and repositories could become targets during disputes between factions vying for legitimacy. His observations do not describe a specific isolated act of destruction, but they introduce a crucial possibility that the library's vulnerability predated Rome entirely. When you bring this perspective into the broader debate, Caesar's involvement becomes one chapter in a longer struggle rather than the genesis of the crisis. This emerging picture destabilizes the entire traditional narrative, and the fourth fact pushes it even further. Later Roman conflicts created additional opportunities for destruction, often overlooked in simplified histories. The Roman Empire experienced repeated internal strife, civil wars, uprisings, and violent leadership transitions, and Alexandria was frequently caught in the crossfire. Historians document episodes in which rival Roman factions inflicted collateral damage on cultural centers, administrative buildings, and public archives. In these contexts, the destruction of manuscripts could easily occur without a single commanding figure intentionally ordering the act. Instead, the library may have suffered incremental losses through the unpredictable turbulence of imperial politics. This interpretation aligns with archaeological evidence suggesting multiple burn layers and structural disturbance across different centuries. When later Roman events are taken into account, Caesar's campaign becomes just one of several moments during which the library might have sustained injuries, perhaps severe, perhaps partial, but never conclusively terminal. If the story stopped there with silence from Caesar, inconsistencies in Plutarch, political tensions noted by Theopompus, and Roman turmoil casting long shadows, it would already be complex enough. But the fifth and final fact in this block introduces a revelation that reshapes the entire question of intent. A Byzantine chronicler, writing many centuries after the earliest fires, asserts that a coordinated purge of certain texts occurred long after Rome's initial involvement. This account is controversial, and scholars debate its reliability. Yet it forces you to confront the possibility that some losses traditionally attributed to earlier periods may instead belong to later ideological or administrative actions. The chronicle describes deliberate targeting of works perceived as politically dangerous, theologically disruptive, or contradictory to imperial orthodoxy. While this testimony cannot serve as definitive proof, it aligns disturbingly well with patterns in the disappearance of other archives across the Eastern Mediterranean. If even part of this account is accurate, then focusing solely on Caesar, or on a single early event, oversimplifies a trajectory shaped by many layers of interest, neglect, and deliberate intervention. When these 5 strands are woven together, Caesar's silence, Plutarch's moralized narrative, Theopompus's warnings about political motives, the destructive potential of later Roman conflicts, and the Byzantine suggestion of coordinated purges, you arrive at a picture far more intricate than the story often repeated in popular culture. The destruction of the library begins to look less like an isolated catastrophe and more like a cumulative process, influenced by shifting political landscapes, ideological struggles, and the vulnerability of centralized knowledge. Blame becomes impossible to assign to a single actor without ignoring the interplay of these forces. And as you navigate this landscape, you begin to understand why historians caution against definitive statements. The evidence simply refuses to cooperate with simple answers. But if intent cannot be neatly pinned down, another question emerges, one that pulls you deeper into the library's interior world. If culprits, motives, and timelines are all entangled, what about the material the library contained? What vanished first? And how do we trace the disappearance when even the catalogues meant to record the contents have themselves been lost? That question directs you toward the next mystery, because unraveling responsibility means little without understanding what was taken from the world. And the absence of the library's own index, the roadmap to its holdings, casts a deeper shadow than any fire ever could. As you move deeper into the library's interior world, you begin to feel the weight of something even more disorienting than the fires, the disappearance of the catalogues themselves. These were not mere administrative tools, they were the scaffolding that held the entire intellectual structure together. Without them, reconstructing what the library contained becomes like navigating a vast building after its floor plan has been erased. And this is where the mystery gains a different texture, not defined by flame or political violence, but by a quieter, more corrosive force, the loss of the very records designed to prevent forgetting. The first realization you encounter is that the most important catalogue ever compiled in antiquity, Callimachus's Pinakes, survives only in remnants and references. Historians describe the Pinakes as a monumental achievement, the world's earliest known attempt to organize knowledge systematically on a massive scale. Callimachus is said to have catalogued hundreds of thousands of scrolls, dividing them into genres, authors, biographies, and thematic clusters. The structure was meticulous enough that later scholars treated it as both encyclopedic and bibliographical. Yet today only fragments remain, preserved second-hand, in quotations, or paraphrased in later scholarly works. This loss shapes everything that follows, because without the Pinakes, every reconstruction of the library's holdings becomes a shadow play of guesses, extrapolations, and indirect testimony. You're not just missing the books, you're missing the map. The problem becomes clearer as you encounter the second major pattern within this block. Ancient sources do not agree on how many scrolls the library held, and the discrepancies are extreme. Some authors describe collections numbering several 100,000, while others reduce the figure significantly. These variations have troubled historians for generations, because they suggest either that the library's holdings changed dramatically over time, or that later writers repeated estimates without verifying them. But the deeper concern is that such disagreement indicates the presence of missing data, even in antiquity. If the catalogues had been intact and widely consulted, later writers would likely have inherited more stable figures. Instead, contradictory numbers circulate freely, hinting that even before the library fell, the clarity of its internal record-keeping may have been eroding. This opens a new line of inquiry, the possibility that the loss of catalogues did not occur all at once, But gradually, as administrative disruptions and political shifts shaped the institution's capacity to maintain its own self-knowledge. The third fact emerges naturally from this instability because none of the surviving index lists fully match the descriptions of the original catalogues. Later bibliographical tools, copies, abridgments, reorganized classifications bear the marks of partial memory and structural revision. Scholars analyzing these documents often find inconsistencies that betray their secondary nature. Some lists emphasize authors that earlier sources treat as marginal. Others omit categories known to have existed in the library's prime. The absences are not random. They reveal patterns that suggest selective survival, perhaps influenced by which works remained popular, which were copied most frequently, or which aligned with later intellectual fashions. Every mismatch between a surviving list and the descriptions of the Panarches widens the gap between what the library once held and what can now be documented. You begin to see the problem not merely as one of loss, but of distortion. The surviving indices are reflections in uneven mirrors, hinting at the structure behind them, but never reproducing it faithfully. Even ancient scholars struggled with these gaps, and that becomes the fourth recurring revelation. Later writers openly complain about missing reference guides. Commentaries from late antiquity and the early medieval period mention the difficulty of tracking down the provenance of certain texts or verifying authorship because the original catalogues were no longer available. These complaints reveal something crucial, that the erosion of the library's internal record was acknowledged even while parts of the collection still existed. The problem wasn't only that scrolls were disappearing, it was that the metadata binding those scrolls into a coherent system was vanishing alongside them. You're confronted with the uncomfortable idea that ancient scholars experienced a sense of intellectual loss similar to what modern researchers feel today. They inherited fragments of an institution they could no longer fully access, forced to navigate its remnants without the roadmap that once made it the most organized repository in the ancient world. Yet, this is not simply a story of frustration. The fifth and final insight in this block reveals a consequence that reaches into every discipline touched by Alexandrian scholarship. The disappearance of metadata severely limits modern attempts at reconstruction. Historians regularly describe how the missing catalogues create blind spots in fields ranging from mathematics to geography to natural philosophy. Without the ability to trace textual lineages, identify variant editions, or verify the relationships between different works, large portions of intellectual history remain uncertain. The absence of catalogues means that even when a surviving text can be linked indirectly to Alexandria, understanding its exact place within the library's network becomes nearly impossible. Did the scroll represent a primary edition or a copy of a copy? Was it part of a larger collection on a specific topic? Did it interact with other works that are now missing? These questions linger unresolved, not because the content is lost, but because the structure organizing that content has vanished. Taken together, these five realities, the disappearance of Callimachus's master catalogue, the contradictory estimates of the library's size, the mismatches in surviving indexes, the ancient complaints about missing guides, and the impact on modern scholarship, create a mystery that feels different from the more dramatic stories of flames and conquest. This is a quieter tragedy, one rooted in the gradual erosion of intellectual order. Fires can destroy scrolls, political turmoil can disperse scholars, but the loss of catalogues destroys something subtler and in some ways more devastating: the relationships between ideas, the connections that reveal how knowledge was gathered, compared, synthesized, and transformed. As you confront this kind of disappearance, you begin to sense that the library's death was not a single event, but a dissolution of structure. The absence of catalogues becomes a metaphor for a deeper unraveling, the gradual loss of the institution's memory of itself. And once you step into that realization, the next mystery emerges with unsettling force. If the catalogues that recorded the library's contents have vanished, what does that mean for the works they described? What kinds of texts were lost so completely that only passing references to them survive? That question leads directly into the next section, because the disappearance of the catalogues opens a doorway into something more provocative, the forbidden and now invisible texts that ancient authors mentioned only briefly, leaving behind hints of ideas modern scholars can describe but never fully recover. By the time you arrive at the threshold of the library's forbidden texts, you can already sense that the losses extend far beyond what surviving catalogues could ever have captured. What distinguishes this part of the mystery is that ancient writers themselves hint at works so unusual, so advanced, or so controversial that they were mentioned only briefly, as if even describing them carried risk. You're no longer dealing with the structural disappearance of catalogues or the physical devastation of fire. You're stepping into the realm of texts known only through the faint echoes left in later sources. These are works that the ancients acknowledged, but which time or human intention erased so thoroughly that only their shadows remain. The first sign of this deeper void emerges from the way later peripatetic writers reference Aristotelian treatises that no longer exist. Scholars studying these commentaries often point out that the authors speak casually about works attributed to Aristotle or his immediate circle, treating them as commonly known in their time. Yet those treatises have vanished completely. The references include descriptions of technical explorations, treatises on mechanics, natural phenomena, or logical structures that go beyond the surviving corpus. The striking part is not merely their absence, but the ease with which later writers cite them, as though they were integral to the intellectual landscape of their era. This ease suggests that these works were widely circulated, or at least well preserved, in authoritative collections, such as Alexandria. And when you consider how central Aristotle's school was to the library's cataloguing and classification systems, the disappearance of entire treatises raises unsettling questions about how much of the philosophical foundation of antiquity relied on texts now irretrievably lost. The fragments hint at ideas that might have influenced scientific development centuries earlier had they survived, leaving you with the uncomfortable realization that the philosophical lineage you recognize today is shaped as much by absence as by preservation. But if the vanished Aristotelian material represents a structural whole, the next layer introduces something stranger. Ancient authors sometimes mention scientific works attributed to legendary or semi-mythical inventors, texts that blend empirical observation with conceptual frameworks that do not fit neatly into the surviving scientific tradition. These references form the second major current in this section. Historians tread cautiously here, noting that some attributions may reflect the habit of assigning anonymous works to emblematic figures, but the consistency of these mentions across different periods is difficult to ignore. Some accounts describe treatises on devices or physical principles that seem out of place for their era, while others allude to writings that explore ideas bordering on the speculative. What matters is not whether these legendary authors truly wrote such texts, but that ancient scholars believed such works existed and treated them as part of the intellectual environment of Alexandria. This belief alone indicates that entire genres of early scientific thinking, some perhaps ahead of their time, others possibly misunderstood, have been erased so completely that only these fleeting references remain. The implications are profound. You're confronted not with the loss of conventional scientific texts, but with the disappearance of works that may have stretched the boundaries of ancient understanding. As you follow these faint signals deeper, the complexity sharpens again. The third piece of this mystery revolves around advanced mathematical texts, known only through summaries or critiques in later writings. Scholars point out how certain Hellenistic mathematicians describe proofs, geometric systems, or arithmetical theories that do not correspond to the surviving works of their predecessors or contemporaries. In some cases, the fragments suggest methods that appear remarkably sophisticated, approaches to number theory, geometry, or proportion that only make sense if they were responding to detailed treatises now missing. You notice that these summaries often refer to arguments or diagrams assumed to be familiar, implying that the original works circulated widely among learned circles. Their disappearance creates a rupture in the lineage of mathematics. Later scholars sometimes struggle to reconstruct the logic behind these lost arguments, treating the summaries as puzzles rather than straightforward records. The result is a landscape of mathematical development marked by voids, where breakthroughs implied by later sources cannot be traced back to their origin. When you consider that many of these summaries reference Alexandria as a center for such research, the sense of loss becomes sharper. The library's destruction didn't just remove books, it severed the continuity of intellectual evolution. If these vanished works were limited to mathematics and science, the mystery would remain significant but contained. Yet the fourth and final current in this section widens the scope dramatically. Several Hellenistic historians cite sources that modern scholars cannot identify, describing entire narratives, records, or ethnographic studies that have left no trace outside the passages that mention them. These cited works often appear to have been treated as authoritative in their time, suggesting they were part of major historical or geographic collections. Their disappearance raises questions not only about what the library held, but about the selectivity of survival. In some cases, the missing works describe events that contradict later canonical histories. In others, they present cultural or political information that would have offered valuable context for understanding the ancient world. The pattern implies that some historical narratives competed with others, and not all endured. Whether their disappearance resulted from neglect, accident, or deliberate exclusion remains uncertain, but the effect is unmistakable. The historical memory of entire regions, peoples, and periods has been reshaped by the absence of these foundational texts. When all four currents in this section converge, the lost Aristotelian treatises, the scientific works attributed to legendary inventors, the advanced mathematics preserved only in summaries, and the missing historical sources, you begin to see the outlines of a deeper problem. The library did not simply lose material, it lost the roots of intellectual pathways that could have unfolded differently. What you recognize as the history of ideas is in part the history of what survived, not what was possible. The missing texts reflect a world more diverse, experimental, and complex than the surviving canon suggests. And this realization forces you to confront a difficult truth. The absence of these works doesn't merely create gaps, it distorts the shape of the past. The ideas preserved today may appear linear or inevitable, but the vanished texts hint at alternative routes, scientific lines of inquiry abandoned because their foundations were erased, philosophical debates rendered invisible because one side fell silent, historical narratives obscured because their sources disappeared. This awareness naturally leads you toward the next frontier of the library's mysteries. If these lost works represent ideas that were once openly referenced, what about texts that ancient authors suggested were restricted, suppressed, or removed? What knowledge was considered too dangerous, too politically volatile, or too ideologically disruptive to preserve? The hints grow sharper as you move forward, because the disappearance of works that were merely obscure is one thing, but the deliberate suppression of knowledge introduces an entirely different dynamic. And that dynamic is exactly what unfolds in the next stage of your journey, where the line between lost learning and forbidden knowledge becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish. As you move from the realm of vanished works into the territory of texts that may have been deliberately withheld, the tone of the mystery shifts. You're no longer dealing solely with the erosion of time or the accidents of history, but with decisions, choices made by people who understood the power of knowledge and sought to control it. The Library of Alexandria was not merely a repository of scrolls, it was a political instrument, a scientific engine, and a potential threat to the ambitions of rulers who recognized that controlling information meant controlling influence. Here, the losses take on a sharpened edge, because the patterns converge on something far more intentional than neglect: the suppression of knowledge deemed too dangerous, too destabilizing, or too revealing to preserve openly. The first indication of this controlled landscape appears in the way certain texts were restricted due to their military relevance. Historians note that the Ptolemies oversaw a kingdom surrounded by potential enemies: Macedonian rivals, rival Greek leagues, shifting alliances with Rome, and the constant possibility of internal revolt. In such an environment, treatises on fortifications, siegecraft, advanced engineering, or naval tactics would have been considered assets of strategic importance. Sources describe how these military works were placed under strict custody, accessible only to individuals authorized by the royal court or the leadership of the museum. These restrictions imply that the library served not only as a center of scholarship, but as a repository of classified knowledge. When regimes changed or political tensions escalated, such works could be removed, copied selectively, or destroyed to prevent their use by rivals. The absence of these military treatises today can therefore be read as something more than accidental loss. It reflects a pattern of deliberate retention and subsequent disappearance, shaped by the priorities of those who governed the kingdom. From here, the path leads naturally into the second major pattern, the existence of royal decrees that controlled access to political archives. Ancient writers mention how certain documents, administrative records, diplomatic correspondence, and governmental analyses were housed in Alexandria, but shielded from public scrutiny. These were not scrolls meant for broad intellectual consumption. They were reflections of statecraft, revealing how the Ptolemies managed their territories, negotiated alliances, or presented themselves to regional powers. The library's proximity to the royal administration meant that some of these sensitive documents inevitably came under its custodianship. Scholars analyzing the scattered references to these archives point out how frequently they vanish from the record following dynastic shifts or moments of political crisis. When new rulers sought to revise the narrative of their predecessors or eliminate information that threatened their legitimacy, these politically charged scrolls were among the most vulnerable. Their disappearance underscores the way the library straddled the boundaries between scholarship and state power, becoming entangled in the ambitions of those who used knowledge as a tool of governance. As you follow the threads further, you encounter a third pattern that expands the scope beyond politics and strategy. Philosophical references to banned religious commentaries. Hellenistic philosophers occasionally mention texts that were prohibited from circulation due to their interpretations of cult practices, esoteric rites, or theological debates that challenged traditional authority. In a city like Alexandria, a crossroads of Egyptian, Greek, Jewish, and other religious traditions, the potential for conflict between competing worldviews was immense. Certain commentaries may have been restricted, not because they were dangerous in a practical sense, but because they threatened ideological cohesion. Some ancient writers hint that these works were classified to prevent misunderstanding or misuse. Others suggest that they were suppressed because they offered interpretations that the authorities found destabilizing. The absence of these religious commentaries today raises questions about how many alternative theological perspectives were lost, perspectives that might have illuminated the complexity of ancient spiritual life. Their disappearance reflects an environment in which intellectual exploration and doctrinal control existed in a delicate balance. But the tension becomes more palpable when you reach the fourth dimension of this pattern. Certain medical works seem to disappear precisely at moments of political transition. Historians note that Alexandrian medicine was among the most advanced in the ancient world, and physicians trained in the museum's network produced treatises that pushed the boundaries of anatomical and physiological understanding. Yet some of these works vanish abruptly, aligning suspiciously with shifts in authority or ideological crackdowns. Scholars debate whether these disappearances reflect institutional realignment, competition among medical schools, or the suppression of ideas deemed too controversial. Some medical texts may have explored procedures or theories that challenged prevailing norms, raising ethical or social questions that rulers preferred to avoid. Others may have been associated with physicians who fell out of favor or whose ideas conflicted with emerging frameworks. The synchronicity between political change and the disappearance of certain medical writings suggests that the fate of these texts was shaped not only by scholarly value but by the precarious intersections of power, belief, and scientific ambition. All of this becomes even more compelling when you consider the fifth element tying these patterns together. Scribes themselves documented cases in which specific manuscripts were deliberately withheld from circulation. These accounts describe moments when individuals tasked with copying or preserving works, reported that certain scrolls were locked away, restricted, or removed from the copying schedule at the direct request of those in authority. Such actions reveal a level of institutional oversight that goes beyond routine curation. They imply that the library operated with multiple layers of access, some scrolls intended for general scholarly use, others reserved for select individuals, and still others hidden or withheld entirely. When scribes mention these practices, they do so with an awareness that something unusual was happening. Their testimony, sparse though it may be, points to a broader structure of control woven into the library's fabric, and the fact that these withheld works often do not survive suggests that restricted access was a precursor to disappearance. When these 5 strands converge, the strategic restriction of military texts, the controlled access to political archives, the suppression of contentious religious commentaries, the disappearance of medical works during political transitions, and the scribe's own observations about withheld manuscripts, you begin to sense how deeply the library was entangled with power. Knowledge was not neutral, it was a resource to be managed, a threat to be mitigated, or a tool to be used selectively. The resulting losses cannot be understood simply as accidents of history. They reflect choices shaped by fear, ambition, ideology, and the desire to control narratives. When you step into the legacy of Eratosthenes, you begin to sense the scale of what the world may have lost. His surviving achievements, calculating Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy, developing a system of latitude and longitude, creating a mathematical sieve to identify prime numbers, are impressive enough on their own. But historians repeatedly emphasize that these remnants represent only a fraction of his intellectual output. The deeper you explore, the more you realize that Eratosthenes stands as a symbol of a much larger disappearance, the vanishing of an entire constellation of scientific work that once illuminated Alexandria's halls. Through scattered references in later authors, you find traces of a mind whose breadth extended far beyond the accomplishments for which he is commonly remembered, revealing a landscape of knowledge that collapsed as the library declined. The first indication of this broader scope appears when ancient writers discuss his contributions outside the areas that still survive. Historians often note that Eratosthenes wrote extensively on topics ranging from poetic criticism to philosophical analysis to advanced mathematics. These works are not merely rumoured, they appear in bibliographies, are cited in letters, and are referenced in scholarly disputes. That such a wide range of disciplines can be traced to him suggests that the surviving texts represent only a narrow window into his intellectual life. You begin to see why many scholars argue that Eratosthenes' surviving corpus should not be treated as the complete story of his work, but rather as the result of selective preservation shaped by forces beyond his control. His lost treatises hint at a polymath who moved effortlessly across disciplines, weaving together insights that might have shaped the trajectory of ancient thought more deeply had they endured. As you follow these echoes, another pattern emerges, revealing the second layer of this mystery. Eratosthenes compiled a comprehensive chronology of world history, a monumental effort that aimed to provide a coherent timeline of major events across different cultures. Later authors mention this chronology approvingly, noting its precision and its ambition, yet the work itself is gone, surviving only through fragments and references. Historians studying these remnants often remark that the loss of this chronology leaves a crucial gap in understanding how ancient scholars reconciled disparate historical traditions. Eratosthenes attempted to align Egyptian, Greek, Persian, and other timelines into a unified system, creating one of the earliest cross-cultural historical frameworks. The disappearance of this work means that modern scholars can only infer his methods from the limited sources that reference them. What remains is a tantalizing outline of a project that would have provided invaluable insight into how the ancients perceived their place in time. Its absence underscores how fragile intellectual ecosystems can be, especially when the infrastructure that supports them collapses. Beyond chronology, you find a third current, pointing to the scale of his contributions. Eratosthenes developed geographical systems that influenced later scholars profoundly, yet the majority of these works are known only through secondary testimony. Ancient geographers frequently cite his methods, his measurements, and his conceptual frameworks. They describe how he sought to map the inhabited world, combining astronomical observations with terrestrial measurements to create a coherent representation of global space. His innovations helped shape the discipline, and even critics acknowledged his foundational role. Yet the original texts are gone. Only scattered quotations and paraphrases remain, each one hinting at a much larger and more sophisticated body of work. When you consider that later geographers built upon his principles, often adapting or refining them, the loss becomes even more pronounced. Without access to the original material, modern scholars are forced to reconstruct his ideas from fragments, an exercise that inevitably raises questions about accuracy and interpretation. The missing works suggest that the map of ancient geography, as it survives today, is built upon an incomplete foundation. But the picture becomes more intricate when you encounter the fourth thread. Some of his mathematical proofs survive only through critics who disagreed with him. Ancient mathematical debates were often framed through commentary and counter-argument, meaning that scholars preserved portions of an opponent's work while attempting to refute it. Eratosthenes appears in this context as both an innovator and a participant in a lively intellectual environment. Yet the critiques that survive quote him selectively, focusing on the points the critics wished to challenge, rather than presenting his full arguments. This creates a distorted view, revealing only fragments shaped by the rhetorical goals of others. Historians caution that relying on such sources risks misunderstanding the original intent and structure of his ideas. The existence of these partial quotations nonetheless reinforces the sense that Eratosthenes' contributions extended into areas far broader than those preserved today. His mathematical imagination becomes visible only in glimpses, filtered through the lens of scholarly contention rather than direct transmission. When you combine these threads, the lost philosophical and scientific treatises, the vanished chronology, the partially preserved geographical work, and the mathematical proofs surviving only through critics, you begin to recognize a pattern that reflects the fifth and final insight of this section. Ancient writers credit Eratosthenes with treatises now completely missing. These references appear across different genres, from literary criticism to scientific commentary. They often describe works that are difficult to fit into the surviving structure of his contributions, suggesting that his intellectual range may have been even broader than scholars currently assume. The disappearance of these treatises raises fundamental questions about how the boundaries of ancient knowledge have shifted. Without them, modern interpretations of Hellenistic science must be constructed from incomplete materials, creating a narrative shaped as much by speculation as by evidence. Eratosthenes becomes, in this sense, both a historical figure and a symbol of what the world lost when Alexandria's intellectual infrastructure fractured. As you trace these absences, you start to understand that the loss of Eratosthenes' work is not an isolated tragedy. It is part of a larger pattern in which great scholars appear in the record with only fragments of their achievements preserved. The erosion of his legacy illustrates the fragility of intellectual continuity. When catalogues disappear, when copying networks falter, when institutional support weakens, even the work of the most influential thinkers can vanish. Eratosthenes' surviving achievements feel like islands in an ocean of forgotten knowledge, glimpses of a world whose full scope can no longer be reconstructed. This realization naturally leads you toward the next stage of investigation, where the forces shaping the library's direction become more visible. If Eratosthenes' work reflects the intellectual ambitions of Alexandria, the political structures surrounding the library reveal how those ambitions were managed, constrained, or redirected. As you move from the scholar to the institution, the focus shifts to the shadow networks operating within the Ptolemaic court groups, whose decisions shaped not only what entered the library, but also what disappeared from it, and those networks form the core of the next section. As you leave the world of Eratosthenes and step into the mechanisms that shaped the library from within, the atmosphere becomes more intricate. you begin to see that the fate of knowledge in Alexandria was not determined solely by scholars or by the accidents of preservation. It was also shaped by a political environment where royalty, advisors, rival factions, and administrative officials all had their own agendas. The library was a beacon of learning, but it was also a tool of statecraft, and the network that operated behind its public face influenced both what the institution acquired and what it allowed to survive. When you follow these undercurrents, the story becomes less about the steady growth of a great scholarly centre and more about the negotiations, conflicts, and quiet interventions that shaped its shelves. The first sign of this hidden machinery appears when you consider how the Ptolemies handled visiting ships. Ancient writers describe how the rulers of Egypt ordered that any books found on ships docking in Alexandria be seized immediately. These scrolls were brought to the library, copied by the royal scribes, and then returned, but the originals remained in the royal collection. While the owners received the copies, historians often interpret this practice as both aggressive and revealing. It shows the Ptolemies' determination to build the world's largest repository of knowledge, but it also reflects a certain authoritarian impulse. Information was something to be absorbed into the royal sphere, not left circulating freely. You begin to realize that the library's acquisitions were not only driven by curiosity or scholarly ambition, they were shaped by a policy of cultural accumulation designed to strengthen the kingdom's intellectual prestige. The result was a collection enriched by the knowledge of the Mediterranean world, but also marked by a willingness to seize rather than simply request. This practice naturally connects to the second current, shaping the library's evolution. Court politics played a decisive role in determining which manuscripts received priority. The Museum was funded and curated by the Ptolemaic court, and its leadership depended on royal favour. Decisions about what to acquire, what to preserve, and what to promote were influenced by the shifting priorities of the royal family. Historians note that certain literary genres flourished at specific times because they aligned with the ideological goals of particular rulers. Works that reinforced the dynasty's legitimacy or highlighted the cultural sophistication of the court were given prominence, while others were neglected. You begin to see how the library reflected not just the intellectual climate of the Hellenistic world, but also the internal dynamics of the Ptolemaic household, a place known for its rivalries, alliances, and sudden reversals. The political orientation of the rulers affected which scholars were patronized, which texts were valued, and which intellectual traditions were encouraged. The library's shelves thus reveal a record not just of intellectual ambition, but of political prioritization. Yet the political shaping of the library was not limited to royal preference. The third piece of this puzzle emerges when you trace instances where rival factions influenced what was removed or sidelined. Scholars studying fragmentary records note moments when works appear to have been displaced or downgraded in prominence due to conflicts within the court. In some cases, texts associated with one advisor or group fell out of favor when another faction gained power. In other instances, works tied to deposed officials or rival claimants to the throne were quietly removed or allowed to deteriorate. The evidence is subtle: scattered references, gaps in catalogues, shifts in citation patterns, but the pattern suggests that intellectual preservation was not immune to political maneuvering. Historians describe the Ptolemaic court as a place where intrigue was common and where alliances shifted frequently. The library's holdings, shaped in part by these tensions, reflect a landscape where knowledge could be repositioned, neglected, or even erased, depending on the fortunes of those connected to it. This undercurrent raises the unsettling possibility that some of the library's losses were not caused by fire or accident, but by the ebb and flow of internal factional power. As you observe how factions influenced what was removed, you also begin to understand how the broader shifts in royal patronage affected the institution's long-term stability. This forms the fourth theme in this network. Changes in patronage reshaped the library's direction. When a new ruler ascended to the throne, priorities often shifted, sometimes subtly, sometimes completely. A king who valued poetry might elevate literary scholars, One who focused on foreign policy might emphasize geographical or diplomatic texts. Another, concerned with internal unrest, might prioritize administrative and legal material. These shifts influenced which research projects received funding, which copying initiatives were launched, and which areas of inquiry thrived or withered. Because the library relied on continuous support for copying, preservation, staffing, and acquisition, changes in patronage had far-reaching consequences. A single ruler's disinterest in certain intellectual fields could result in the gradual neglect of entire sections of the collection. Over decades, these shifts accumulated, shaping what survived and what vanished. You begin to realize that the library's intellectual trajectory was not a steady upward climb, but a series of redirections shaped by the changing pressures and preferences of the Ptolemaic court. When you assemble these currents, the aggressive acquisition policies imposed on visiting ships, the political influences determining which manuscripts were prioritized, the factional struggles shaping what was removed or sidelined, and the transformations caused by changing patterns of royal patronage, you begin to see the library not as a static monument of knowledge, but as a dynamic institution, deeply embedded in the political world around it. Its growth was inseparable from the ambitions of a ruling dynasty that sought cultural dominance as part of its identity. Its losses were intertwined with the vulnerabilities of a court where power shifted rapidly and decisively. The result is a picture of an institution whose fate was shaped not only by scholarly brilliance, but by the unpredictabilities of political life. This understanding opens a path to the next layer of the mystery, because once you recognize how the library absorbed and lost material based on internal politics, you are drawn toward another question. How did these forces shape the library's external acquisitions, the texts it gathered from beyond Egypt's borders, and the contradictions left behind by those practices? To answer that, you must look beyond the court itself, toward the broader Mediterranean flows of knowledge, and the strange, sometimes troubling inconsistencies that appear when you follow the library's methods of gathering texts on an international scale, and that is exactly where the next section leads. As you step beyond the internal politics of the Ptolemaic court and follow the traces of the library's relationships with the broader Mediterranean world, the nature of the mystery expands. The library was not merely a passive recipient of knowledge, it was an active force reaching outward, drawing texts from distant regions and foreign traditions. But the further you follow its acquisitions, the more you begin to see contradictions that complicate the institution's celebrated image. What at first appears as a simple story of cultural exchange becomes something far more intricate, shaped by ambition, appropriation, and selective preservation. By examining how manuscripts entered Alexandria and how some of those acquisitions later disappeared, a new layer of uncertainty unfolds. The first realization you encounter is that the library's collection included entire bodies of work seized during military campaigns. Ancient sources describe how victorious leaders sent captured books back to Alexandria as trophies. Historians note that these seizures were not limited to small collections, but sometimes included entire archives taken from conquered cities. The practice reflects a broader Hellenistic pattern in which cultural assets were treated as part of the spoils of war. For the library, this meant gaining access to materials that otherwise would have remained within local traditions or regional intellectual networks. But such acquisitions also introduce questions. When knowledge arrives as the result of conquest, its integration into a new intellectual environment may alter its context, purpose, or interpretation. Some of these seized collections later vanish completely from the historical record, leaving you to wonder whether their disappearance stemmed from neglect, assimilation, or the selective priorities of Alexandria's scholars. The very act of appropriation becomes a double-edged phenomenon, enriching the library while simultaneously destabilizing the traditions from which the works came. As you examine these military acquisitions, your path leads naturally into the second pattern, the library's practice of copying all borrowed texts before returning them. Ancient writers describe how foreign rulers, diplomats, and scholars sent manuscripts to Alexandria for the purpose of exchange, verification, or scholarly comparison. The library, in turn, made copies of these works and then returned the originals, except that in many cases they returned the copies instead and retained the originals. This policy reveals something about the institution's mindset. The Ptolemaic rulers saw knowledge as a form of capital, and possession of original manuscripts signified authority. By keeping the originals, they strengthened the library's prestige and ensured that scholars in Alexandria had access to the most authentic materials. Yet the policy also created resentment abroad and raised questions about the ethics of the library's acquisition methods. For modern historians, the pattern complicates efforts to trace textual lineages because the movement of manuscripts between Alexandria and other centers becomes entangled in uncertainty. The presence of multiple versions, originals held in Alexandria, copies circulated elsewhere, makes it difficult to determine which texts reflect the earliest traditions and which represent later permutations. This complexity becomes more pronounced when you encounter the third theme. Jewish scholars working on the Septuagint reported Alexandrian copies that diverged significantly from other traditions. Ancient accounts describe how translations of Hebrew scriptures into Greek were produced under royal patronage, a process that required consultation with Alexandrian manuscripts. These manuscripts, however, did not always align with the texts preserved in Jewish communities elsewhere. The divergence raises questions about the origins of the Alexandrian versions. Historians debate whether these differences arise from the use of variant source texts, local interpretive traditions, or modifications introduced during copying. What becomes clear is that Alexandria acted not only as a site of preservation, but also as a place where texts could take on new forms. This observation suggests that the library did not merely absorb foreign knowledge, it shaped it, whether intentionally or not. Its scribes contributed to the evolution of sacred texts, influencing how generations to come understood foundational traditions. The existence of divergent copies preserved in Alexandria complicates the narrative of a simple, passive repository. Instead, it reveals a dynamic environment where textual traditions interacted, evolved, and sometimes clashed. These complexities grow deeper when you consider a fourth element: the gaps in diplomatic gift records. Ancient rulers often exchanged books as part of ceremonial or diplomatic relationships, and some of these exchanges involved the library. Yet modern historians observing the surviving lists find inconsistencies, books that appear in earlier records but not in later ones, or references to collections supposedly delivered to Alexandria that never appear again. These discrepancies suggest that some acquisitions may have been lost, misattributed, or absorbed into other categories without proper documentation. In some cases, the gaps align with political changes or conflicts, implying that valuable manuscripts might have been diverted, withheld, or eliminated deliberately. The inconsistencies leave you with a sense that the library's acquisitions were not always systematically recorded, and that the institutional memory surrounding these exchanges was vulnerable to disruption. For a place that prided itself on preservation and cataloguing, the absence of these materials is striking. The missing pieces in diplomatic lists hint at a murky zone where the flow of knowledge is partially visible but never fully illuminated. The deeper you delve, the more this uncertainty is reinforced by a fifth and final pattern: ancient references to combined Greek-Egyptian works that have entirely vanished. Scholars analyzing fragmentary citations find mentions of hybrid texts, treatises blending Greek scientific or philosophical frameworks with Egyptian religious or technical traditions. These works represent a level of cultural synthesis that would have been uniquely Alexandrian, reflecting the city's role as a meeting point of traditions. Yet, none of these hybrid texts survive. Their disappearance is particularly puzzling because they would have played a significant role in shaping cross-cultural understanding. Some historians speculate that such works were too specialized or too esoteric to be widely copied. Others suggest that political or religious shifts made them inconvenient to preserve. Their absence creates another layer of distortion in the historical record, removing evidence of a complex intellectual dialogue that might have reshaped modern understanding of ancient scientific and religious thought. As these five currents converge, you begin to see that the library's approach to acquisition was both ambitious and problematic. On one hand, the institution amassed vast quantities of knowledge from across the world, expanding its influence and shaping the intellectual climate of the ancient Mediterranean. On the other hand, the inconsistencies, divergences, and disappearances associated with these acquisitions reveal the fragility of that ambition. Knowledge entered the library through conquest, appropriation, copying, diplomacy, and cultural synthesis, but its survival depended on political stability, administrative accuracy, and sustained scholarly interest. When those elements faltered, the materials most dependent on careful stewardship were the first to be lost. This realization leads you toward a new question, one that shifts the focus from the acquisition of texts to the fate of the individuals who produced them. The library depended on scholars, some famous, some obscure, to create, interpret, and maintain its intellectual legacy. Yet the historical record reveals that many of these figures appear briefly, leave traces of brilliance, and vanish without explanation. Their stories hold clues not only to the library's past, but to the pressures and vulnerabilities that shaped its internal life, and it is their disappearance that draws you into the next section. As you turn from the library's acquisitions to the people responsible for shaping its intellectual life, you begin to realize how many scholars passed through Alexandria only to vanish into obscurity. Some were brilliant thinkers whose work drew admiration in their own lifetimes. Others left only a faint trace, a name in a catalogue, a citation in a surviving commentary, a passing mention in a philosophical dispute. Their disappearance is not simply a matter of lost manuscripts. It reflects deeper vulnerabilities within the library's environment, where the fates of scholars depended on political stability, institutional support, and the careful transmission of their contributions. When you look closely at the record, a pattern emerges. Individuals who once influenced the intellectual climate of Alexandria faded from history, leaving behind questions about what they created, what they inspired, and what disappeared with them. The first indication of this pattern appears when you encounter scholars who emerge briefly in the historical record, produce significant work, and then dissolve into silence. Historians note that Alexandria attracted thinkers from across the Mediterranean, mathematicians, poets, physicians, astronomers, philosophers, yet many of these individuals appear only in fragments, a reference to a lost treatise, a short biographical note, an attribution preserved in another author's critique. Their intellectual presence is undeniable, but the absence of surviving work or detailed biography suggests that their contributions were not preserved systematically. Scholars speculate that some of these figures may have been overshadowed by more famous contemporaries, their manuscripts deemed less essential during periods of copying or recataloguing. Others may have suffered from political fluctuations. When patronage shifted, scholars associated with a previous regime could lose their standing, and along with it, the institutional support required for their work to endure. The resulting gaps create a landscape where many promising voices flicker briefly before disappearing entirely from view. As you follow these faint traces, the second current in this pattern emerges. The scholars who left only one or two works known through indirect reference. Later writers occasionally mention treatises attributed to these individuals, sometimes approvingly, sometimes critically, but the treatises themselves do not survive. This phenomenon is particularly prominent in fields like medicine, philology, and technical science, where specialized knowledge circulated within narrow scholarly communities. If the works were not copied widely or did not align with later intellectual trends, they could vanish quickly once institutional support faltered. Historians examining these cases often remark that the presence of citations indicates that the works were influential enough to be read and debated, yet the absence of the texts themselves suggests that their influence was not robust enough to secure long-term preservation. This phenomenon is not limited to minor figures. Even respected scholars sometimes saw their work disappear when political changes disrupted copying networks. The fragility of these contributions highlights how dependent the survival of knowledge was on institutional continuity, something Alexandria could not always provide. The third dimension of this mystery becomes clearer when you observe how social and political turmoil affected the scholars themselves. Alexandria was a city frequently shaken by riots, factional conflicts, and periods of violent unrest. Historians document episodes in which scholars were caught in the crossfire, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively. Changes in royal patronage could determine who held influence within the museion, and scholars associated with a losing faction could find themselves marginalized or expelled. In such a volatile environment, it is not surprising that some scholars vanished from the record. They may have left the city, been displaced by political upheaval, or lost access to the resources necessary to continue their research. Their manuscripts, tied closely to their institutional affiliations, could easily be neglected or destroyed during periods of administrative reorganization. You begin to see how the library's intellectual life was shaped by forces beyond scholarly merit. The disappearance of these individuals reflects not only the fragility of written material, but also the precariousness of the scholars' positions within the city's shifting political landscape. Yet the problem extends even further, becoming more intricate when you consider how ancient authors relied on sources that are now entirely unknown. This forms the fourth current: scholars who served as authorities in their time, but whose works have left no trace. Later writers quote them or build upon their ideas, treating them as respected figures. But without the original text, modern historians can only reconstruct their contributions indirectly. This situation is especially common in fields like geography and historiography, where early compilers synthesized information from numerous sources no longer identifiable. These lost figures once constituted part of the intellectual backbone of Alexandria's scholarly network. Their disappearance reveals how much of that network has dissolved. The surviving citations serve as shadows pointing toward a world of argument, debate, and collaboration that no longer exists. You are left with the sense that the library's intellectual community was far larger and more dynamic than the surviving texts allow you to see. The final thread completing this portrait emerges when you examine the abruptness with which some scholars disappear from the record. Historians describe cases where individuals seem active and prominent, producing work, engaging in scholarly debates, and influencing others, only for their trail to end without explanation. This sudden vanishing could reflect personal misfortune, political suppression, but it also highlights the limited reach of ancient biographical traditions. Unless a scholar reached exceptional prominence or was preserved through later commentary, their life and work could easily fade from memory. The disappearance of these individuals becomes symbolic of the library's fragility. The institution promised a kind of immortality through preservation, yet even within its walls, many scholars slipped from history, their ideas preserved only in fleeting illusions. When you weave together these five elements, the fleeting appearances of scholars who vanish from the record, the lost treatises known only through citation, the vulnerability of intellectual life to political turmoil, the dependence on unidentified sources in later works, and the abrupt disappearance of once prominent thinkers, you arrive at a haunting conclusion. The library was not simply a guardian of knowledge, it was a place where brilliance could be extinguished as easily as it was nurtured. The structure that preserved the greatest works of antiquity could not protect every contributor. The gaps left behind by these missing figures create a sense of intellectual silence, spaces where ideas once flourished but no longer speak. And this silence directs you toward another part of the library's story. The institutions connected to it, particularly the Serapeum, which served not only as an extension of the library, but as a refuge for works displaced by the pressures and upheavals shaping Alexandria. To understand how knowledge survived outside the main complex, and why some works were shifted into hidden or secondary spaces, you must follow the trail leading toward that daughter library, whose fate is woven deeply into Alexandria's broader story. When you move toward the Serapeum, the so-called daughter Library of Alexandria, you begin to see the institution from a different angle. The Serapeum was not a mere satellite. It functioned as a refuge, a second center of intellectual life that absorbed the pressures and disruptions shaping the museum. Its relationship with the main library was fluid, sometimes independent, sometimes tightly intertwined. As you explore its history, you discover how it became a haven for knowledge displaced during political turmoil, a place where scholars continued their work even when the heart of the city grew unstable. Yet the Serapeum did not simply preserve the remnants of a fading institution. It developed its own identity, shaping Alexandria's intellectual landscape in ways that often remain obscured by the focus on the main library. Your first glimpse of this distinct role appears when ancient writers describe how the Serapeum served as a protective space for texts during periods when the main library faced uncertainty. Historians point out that the Serapeum housed copies, commentaries, and primary manuscripts connected to the museum, functioning as a repository linked to but not entirely controlled by the royal precinct. This connection positioned it as a natural refuge during periods of conflict. When the royal quarter faced threats, fires, riots, or abrupt power shifts, materials of importance could be transferred to the Serapeum for safekeeping. This means that part of the library's intellectual continuity depended on the durability of this secondary institution. The Serapeum allowed scholarship to persist even when the main center faltered. You begin to grasp how the fate of Alexandrian knowledge was distributed across multiple sites, not confined to the single monumental space often imagined. From here, your attention naturally shifts to the second theme. Archaeological evidence confirms that the Serapeum was a substantial institution, complete with lecture halls, storage rooms, and scholarly spaces. Excavations reveal architectural features consistent with its role as both a temple to Serapis and a center of learning. Artifacts discovered on-site, inkwells, writing tools, architectural fragments of reading rooms suggest a vibrant scholarly environment. Historians emphasize that these findings align closely with ancient descriptions of the Serapeum as a functioning intellectual hub. This material record reinforces the idea that the Serapeum was not merely a refuge, but a fully operational extension of the library's mission. It supported scholars, preserved manuscripts, and housed collections that might otherwise have been lost. The archaeological footprint provides tangible evidence that this space held an institutional identity strong enough to stand on its own. As you explore this environment, you encounter a third dimension that complicates the narrative of preservation. The Serapeum appears to have held materials deemed especially valuable or sensitive. Ancient accounts refer to certain works being protected there during turbulent times, suggesting that the Serapeum served as a vault for knowledge considered too important to risk in the more exposed areas of the city. This protective function is consistent with its architectural features, many of which emphasize security and controlled access. Scholars interpret these references as evidence that the Serapeum held texts that were not only essential for intellectual continuity, but also vulnerable to political or ideological shifts. In this sense, the Serapeum did not merely duplicate the library's holdings. It played a role in safeguarding specific materials that required additional security. This raises intriguing questions about how knowledge was prioritized, which texts were protected, who decided their value, and what criteria shaped the movement of manuscripts between institutions. If this were the full picture, the Serapeum might appear as a secure anchor for the library's intellectual heritage, but the fourth and final layer in this section reveals a different path. Even the Serapeum could not escape the cycles of conflict that shaped Alexandria. Historians note that its eventual destruction in the late 4th century CE marked a profound turning point in the city's cultural history. While debates persist about the exact extent of its collections at the time of its fall, ancient witnesses describe the event as a significant rupture. The destruction reflected not only religious tensions, but also the diminished capacity of Alexandria to protect its intellectual institutions. The Serapeum, which had served as a refuge during earlier periods, became itself a victim of forces beyond its walls. In its collapse, the fragile continuity it once safeguarded was severed. The loss of the Serapeum closes a chapter in which preservation and vulnerability existed side by side. both shaped by shifting political and ideological landscapes. When you bring these threads together, the Serapeum's role as a refuge, the archaeological evidence of its scholarly environment, its protection of sensitive materials, and its eventual destruction, you begin to understand that the library's survival was never dependent on a single site. It relied on a distributed network of knowledge centers, each vulnerable in different ways. The Serapeum represents the resilience and the fragility of this network. It shows how knowledge could be preserved through institutional redundancy, but also how that redundancy could fail when broader historical forces overwhelmed it. The Serapeum's story expands your understanding of Alexandria's intellectual ecosystem, revealing the balance of preservation and loss that shaped the fate of countless texts. This realization leads you directly into the next domain of the library's mysteries, the ideological, religious, and political pressures that influenced what could be preserved, what was suppressed, and how the intellectual climate shifted as power changed hands. To understand those pressures and their effects, you must turn to the next stage of the narrative, where the intersection of belief, authority, and knowledge begins to reshape the entire landscape of Alexandria's scholarly legacy. As you move from the Serapeum into the broader landscape of Alexandria's ideological transformations, you begin to see how deeply religious and political tensions shaped the fate of the library. Knowledge in Alexandria did not circulate freely. It moved through channels defined by authority, belief, and the shifting boundaries of what was considered acceptable. When rulers or factions attempted to assert control, the first battleground was often intellectual. Texts were censored, reinterpretations were encouraged, and entire fields of inquiry could be reoriented by decree. This atmosphere created vulnerabilities that no institution, even one as powerful as the library, could fully withstand. When you follow the traces of these ideological pressures, the story becomes a study in how knowledge evolves, contracts, or disappears when belief systems intersect with power. The first realization you encounter is that sudden shifts in religious priorities often produced abrupt changes in what scholars were allowed to copy, circulate, or teach. Historians studying the late Hellenistic and early Roman periods describe episodes when rulers or influential groups redefined the boundaries of acceptable discourse. These shifts influenced which texts were promoted and which were sidelined. In some eras, philosophical schools advocating particular metaphysical ideas were encouraged. In others, they found themselves constrained. The library's scribes responded to these shifts through their copying patterns, privileging works aligned with current ideologies. This dynamic reveals that ideological pressure did not always take the form of destruction. Sometimes it worked through redirection, altering the intellectual map of Alexandria by promoting certain traditions, while allowing others to fade. The resulting distortions, though subtle, shaped the trajectory of scholarship for generations. As you follow these ideological movements, the second current becomes clear. Historical accounts reveal that at multiple points in Alexandria's history, direct intervention shaped what was allowed to be taught or disseminated. Some of these interventions emerged from political crises, others from religious disputes. Ancient writers recount instances when certain doctrines were banned or labeled dangerous, resulting in the removal of corresponding texts from circulation. Such decisions often reflected broader conflicts, including struggles between competing philosophical schools, rivalries between religious communities, or power plays within the ruling elite. These interventions left marks on the intellectual record. When works disappear or survive only in hostile commentary, the underlying cause is often not accident, but the result of deliberate suppression. You begin to understand how vulnerable knowledge becomes when its value is determined by those in authority, and how easily intellectual traditions can be reshaped by decisions rooted in ideology rather than scholarship. The third dimension of this landscape emerges when you observe how religious conflicts influenced the preservation of certain works. Alexandria's population was famously diverse, encompassing Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and later Christian communities. Each group brought its own intellectual traditions, theological frameworks, and textual heritages. Yet these traditions did not always coexist peacefully. Historians document periods where tensions escalated into violence or political activism, producing changes in which ideas could be openly expressed. In some cases, works associated with minority traditions were removed or treated with suspicion. In others, texts central to emerging groups were promoted aggressively. The interplay of these forces contributed to a selective process of preservation. Works aligned with dominant ideologies enjoyed greater longevity, while those associated with marginalized or declining communities faced increased risk of disappearance. The resulting record reflects the winners of ideological contests rather than a neutral transmission of knowledge. The selective preservation becomes even more visible when you follow the fourth thread, the influence of evolving philosophical priorities. Within the intellectual world of Alexandria, different philosophical schools rose and fell in prominence depending on the political climate. When a particular school gained influence, whether Stoic, Platonic, Aristotelian, or later Christian, the library's activities often reflected that change. Texts supporting favored doctrines were copied more frequently, integrated into teaching programs, or highlighted in scholarly debates. Those falling out of favor might receive less attention or be omitted from copying cycles. Historians studying these patterns point out how often the survival of a text depends not on its intrinsic value, but on whether it fit into the needs of a specific intellectual moment. This dynamic created long-term consequences. Philosophical traditions that enjoyed institutional support shaped the intellectual canon, while others faded into obscurity not because they lacked merit, but because they lacked alignment with the prevailing worldview. Yet none of these forces fully prepare you for the fifth and final layer of this section. Evidence shows that at various points, ideological purges targeted specific areas of knowledge. Some purges were small in scale, removing only a handful of text deemed inappropriate. Others were far more impactful, reshaping the intellectual landscape by eliminating whole categories of work. These actions were often justified through appeals to moral, religious, or political necessity. Historians emphasize how these purges created irreversible voids, gaps that alter modern understanding of ancient thought. When entire textual traditions disappear, the development of ideas becomes harder to trace, and connections between intellectual movements are obscured. The pattern reveals a world in which knowledge was not merely curated, but actively contested, and where the boundaries of acceptable inquiry were constantly renegotiated. When these elements converge, the shifts in authorized scholarship, direct interventions in teaching, the influence of religious conflict, the role of philosophical priorities, and the impact of ideological purges, you see how fragile the library's intellectual ecosystem truly was. Ideas flourished when they aligned with authority, but became vulnerable when they challenged prevailing beliefs. This fragile balance shaped what was preserved and what was lost. The library's reputation as a universal repository of knowledge can obscure the reality that much of what it held existed within contested ideological terrain. With this understanding, you move toward a moment in Alexandria's history that crystallizes the human cost of these ideological tensions. The life and death of Hypatia. Her story illuminates not only the dangers faced by scholars in volatile climates, but also the intellectual losses that accompany such conflicts. And her disappearance from the city's scholarly community leads directly into the next stage of this investigation. When you arrive at the figure of Hypatia, the landscape of Alexandria sharpens into focus. Her life stands at a crossroads where scholarship, political tension, and religious transformation collide. She was not simply a mathematician or philosopher, she was a highly visible representative of an intellectual tradition that was becoming increasingly vulnerable. As you move through the surviving evidence, you begin to understand that what was lost with Hypatia extends far beyond the tragedy of her death. Beneath the violence lies another disappearance, one tied directly to the works she engaged with, referenced, or helped preserve. By tracing these subtle gaps, you uncover the shape of a deeper intellectual rupture. Your first encounter with this rupture comes when historians note that Hypatia's teachings drew heavily on works that no longer exist. Although her role as a commentator is well established, the texts she used to teach advanced mathematics and astronomy are often known only through her students' remarks or her correspondents' fragmented records. Scholars point out that these references include treatises by earlier mathematicians and philosophers whose works have disappeared entirely. The simple fact that Hypatia taught from these sources demonstrates that they survived into the early 5th century, yet their subsequent absence suggests that the conditions supporting their preservation collapsed soon afterward. When you see how central these vanished works were to her curriculum, the loss becomes more than a matter of missing manuscripts. It becomes an indicator of the intellectual lineage that ended with her. This sense of a severed lineage becomes clearer when you follow the second current, the missing treatises that Hypatia herself is believed to have authored or revised. Ancient sources attribute several works to her, including commentaries on Diophantus, Apollonius, and other mathematicians, but none of these texts survive in complete form. Historians studying these fragments suggest that Hypatia's influence extended far beyond her teaching. She contributed to a tradition of commentary that helped transmit complex ideas across generations. Her role in refining and clarifying mathematical works meant that she stood at a critical juncture in the evolution of ancient mathematics. The disappearance of her contributions obscures not only her personal impact, but also the continuity of a tradition that bridged Hellenistic scholarship and later scientific developments. The absence of these texts creates a gap in the chain of transmission, leaving you to wonder how much of the later mathematical canon was shaped by her interpretations, now lost to time. As you follow this thread, a third dimension of the mystery emerges. The nature of the works Hypatia referenced, taught, or preserved often cannot be fully reconstructed because their contexts vanished along with her. Scholars attempting to map her intellectual environment note how frequently sources mention materials that no longer exist, advanced astronomical models, commentaries on Neoplatonic metaphysics, and treatises connecting mathematics to cosmology. These hints suggest that Hypatia operated within an intellectual world, richer and more diverse than the surviving record reveals. Yet without the texts she used or produced, modern scholars can only infer the extent of her knowledge. This absence distorts the understanding of the period, making it appear narrower and less sophisticated than it truly was. Hypatia stands as a reminder that the intellectual landscape of late antiquity cannot be reconstructed solely from surviving material. The void surrounding her writings reveals how much was lost in the turbulence of her era. All of this brings you to the fourth and final element that completes this picture. Ancient writers repeatedly emphasize that Hypatia's death represented not only a personal tragedy, but a profound break in the city's intellectual continuity. Her position in Alexandria's scholarly community was exceptional. She taught publicly, corresponded with high-ranking officials, and advised political leaders. Her influence extended across philosophical, mathematical, and civic spheres. When she was murdered amid escalating religious and political tensions, the immediate consequences reverberated across Alexandria. Historians note that her death coincided with a decline in the city's intellectual vibrancy. The works she studied and taught, the manuscripts she helped preserve, and the commentaries she produced all suffered from the loss of the institutional framework that had sustained them. In the aftermath, intellectual life in Alexandria shifted dramatically. The museum was no longer the center of philosophical inquiry it had been, and the traditions that depended on figures like Hypatia gradually dissolved. When you take these elements together, the vanished works she used, the missing treatises attributed to her, the disappearance of the intellectual context that surrounded her, and the sudden rupture caused by her death, you begin to see how Hypatia embodies a pivotal moment in the library's story. She represents the point where scholarly continuity meets historical disruption. What disappeared with her was not only her own work, but the broader intellectual ecosystem she inhabited. This realization leads you naturally toward the next stage of the investigation, where the idea of hidden or restricted knowledge takes on a physical dimension. If Hypatia's era reveals how intellectual continuity can falter, the next section turns to the possibility that the library's layout itself concealed layers of knowledge that were never intended for public view, spaces that may have sheltered sensitive texts and left behind traces of a world now barely visible. As you move deeper into the architectural and organizational mysteries of the library, the idea of hidden spaces begins to shift from speculation into something more grounded. Ancient writers hint that the institution's design was far more complex than the grand reading halls often imagined. References scattered across different sources suggest that the library may have included restricted chambers, secured archives, and specialized rooms meant for materials not intended for general scholarly circulation. These whispers grow more substantial when you begin to place them alongside archaeological observations and the fragmentary descriptions preserved in ancient texts. What emerges is a picture of a multi-layered institution, one in which public scholarship coexisted with classified or protected areas, each serving different purposes in the preservation and curation of knowledge. Your first indication of these hidden layers appears in ancient descriptions of the library's architecture. Writers who visited the museum describe large halls filled with scholars, but they also mention rooms dedicated to specific tasks: copying, editing, storing catalogues, and curating rare materials. Some of these areas were open only to authorized staff or members of the museum's scholarly community. Historians studying these accounts note that the references are not detailed enough to map precisely, but they suggest a structure designed to differentiate between levels of access. This differentiation implies that the library did not treat all knowledge equally. Materials considered delicate, controversial, or otherwise sensitive likely required additional protection. Such hints offer a window into a world where knowledge was organized not only by topic, but also by its perceived importance or risk. As you follow these architectural traces, the second current becomes clearer. Ancient sources describe collections that were explicitly restricted. Some writers refer to archives containing treaties, royal correspondence, and official documents that were not accessible to ordinary scholars. These records were valuable not only for their content, but also for the political leverage they represented. The need to protect them explains why they were placed in secured chambers rather than in open reading rooms. Historians analyze these references as evidence that the library functioned in part as an administrative archive, preserving state documents alongside scholarly materials. This dual function required a hierarchy of access that shaped the library's internal design. The existence of such restricted archives suggests that not all of the institution's holdings would have been known even to the scholars who worked there daily. A third piece of the puzzle emerges when you examine archaeological and textual clues suggesting the presence of hidden or specialized rooms. Excavations in the area, believed to have once housed the museum, reveal architectural anomalies, subterranean spaces, corridors with uncertain purposes, and fragments of structures that hint at compartmentalized environments. While the evidence is incomplete, historians note that these features align with ancient descriptions of the museum as a complex with many rooms serving different functions. Some of these areas may have been intended for manuscripts that required special care or secrecy. The idea of restricted rooms gains further support from references to internal archives or classified collections in late antiquity. These mentions are brief and often ambiguous, but they reinforce the possibility that certain chambers were known only to a select group of scholars or officials. The hidden spaces remain elusive, but their traces suggest that parts of the library were deliberately concealed. As you consider these physical hints, the fourth dimension of the mystery emerges with greater force. Ancient sources imply that some of these restricted collections held material considered sensitive for religious, political, or philosophical reasons. Writers mention treatises dealing with sacred rituals, disputed theological ideas, or interpretations that challenged established doctrines. These works might have been protected to prevent misuse or suppressed to maintain ideological stability. Historians studying these accounts emphasize that such texts occupied a precarious position. They were valuable as intellectual artifacts, but potentially disruptive in the wrong hands. Their placement in hidden or restricted areas reflects a tension at the heart of the library's mission, the desire to gather all knowledge alongside the need to control its dissemination. This tension becomes more apparent when you consider the political and religious upheavals that swept through Alexandria. Restricted materials would have been especially vulnerable during such periods. The fifth and final thread in this section draws from scattered references to specialized archives used by scholars for advanced or experimental research. These archives, according to ancient authors, contain materials not typically circulated, works used for comparative study, commentary, or analysis that required protection due to their fragility or rarity. Historians interpret these mentions as evidence that the library's structure supported different layers of scholarly engagement. Some materials were meant for teaching, others for preservation, still others for high-level analysis that demanded controlled conditions. The existence of such specialized archives implies that the library's holdings were stratified, with certain areas designed to shelter insights not yet ready for broad dissemination. This structure reveals a sophisticated understanding of how knowledge develops through stages, from collection to interpretation to distribution. When you weave these 5 elements together, the architectural hints of restricted spaces, the presence of classified archives, the archaeological traces of concealed rooms, the references to sensitive materials, and the existence of specialized scholarly archives, you begin to see the library not as a single open space, but as a layered institution. It housed knowledge at different levels of visibility, each shaped by practical, political, and intellectual needs. The hidden rooms were not anomalies. They were part of an intentional strategy to manage the complexity of ancient scholarship. This structure challenges the popular image of the library as a completely open repository. Instead, it reveals a place where access was negotiated, where knowledge was stratified, and where the boundaries of visibility reflected the values and anxieties of the age. This understanding leads you into the next stage of the investigation, where the focus shifts from the internal structure to the external networks that shaped the library's global connections. If hidden rooms reveal how knowledge was protected within Alexandria, the next section explores how exchanges with other cultures created flows of information that sometimes vanished as mysteriously as they appeared. When you turn from the hidden rooms of the library to the world beyond Alexandria, the narrative expands outward into a web of international exchanges, flows of manuscripts, correspondence, and scholarly gifts that once connected the museum to courts, academies, and intellectual centers across the ancient world. These exchanges reveal a library that was not isolated, but deeply embedded in a global network of learning. Yet the deeper you follow these currents, the more you notice how often the traces of these interactions fade. Diplomatic gift lists shrink, correspondence disappears, and manuscripts mentioned in foreign inventories never appear in the surviving traces of Alexandria's holdings. The gaps are revealing. They show how the library continuously received, borrowed, and exchanged texts, yet preserved only fragments of the record describing those movements. Understanding these flows helps illuminate not only what the library gained, but also what may have vanished long before its final decline. Your first glimpse of these exchanges emerges from ancient diplomatic records that describe rulers sending entire sets of manuscripts to Alexandria as gestures of respect or alliance. These gifts often included regional histories, philosophical works, or scientific treatises meant to showcase the intellectual achievements of the donor's culture. Historians note that such exchanges served multiple purposes. They strengthened diplomatic ties, elevated the prestige of participating courts, and expanded the library's holdings. Yet when modern scholars attempt to trace these donated texts, many are absent from later references to Alexandrian collections. Their disappearance raises questions. Some may have been absorbed into specific research archives or restricted chambers. Others may have been lost during periods of turmoil. But the striking fact is that the library's reputation for comprehensiveness masks a history filled with missing diplomatic exchanges. gifts that once entered the institution but left no visible footprint in surviving literature. As you follow these missing streams, the second pattern becomes clearer. Several foreign scholars mention sending texts to Alexandria for comparison or verification, but the corresponding Alexandrian responses are lost. Ancient intellectual culture valued accuracy, and scholars often sought the expertise of Alexandria's scribes to confirm disputed passages or resolve textual variations. These interactions produced notes, letters, and revised editions. Historians studying the remnants of such correspondence point out that these exchanges indicate an active, dynamic relationship between Alexandria and other centers of learning. Yet the absence of reciprocal documentation suggests that Alexandria's own archives of these communications may have been among the earliest materials to vanish. This possibility becomes even more compelling when you consider how often foreign authors describe receiving annotated copies or corrected versions from Alexandria. The evidence shows that the library played a role in shaping the textual traditions of other regions, but the internal records of that editorial activity are gone, leaving only half of the conversation preserved. The third thread deepens this sense of asymmetry when you examine how certain bodies of knowledge appear in international records, but not in Alexandrian ones. Scholars studying ancient scientific literature occasionally find references to works said to have been sent to Alexandria as gifts or diplomatic offerings, yet those texts do not appear in any surviving description of the library's holdings. This phenomenon is especially pronounced in fields like astronomy, engineering, and ethnography. The absence of these works in Alexandrian catalogues does not prove they were never received. Rather, it suggests that they may have been lost early or placed in specialized archives whose contents no longer survive. The discrepancies force you to confront the possibility that the library's own record-keeping was far from perfect. Even an institution renowned for its cataloging systems could not preserve all traces of its international acquisitions. These gaps highlight the fragility of cross-cultural knowledge exchange and how easily materials can disappear even within a center devoted to preservation. The fourth dimension becomes visible when you consider foreign accounts of Alexandrian manuscripts that diverged from other textual traditions. Scholars from distant regions sometimes report receiving works from Alexandria that demonstrated unfamiliar readings or unusual commentaries. These manuscripts indicate that the library possessed versions of texts that differed from those circulating elsewhere. Yet when modern researchers examine the surviving fragments of Alexandrian scholarship, many of these divergent versions are absent. Historians interpret this as evidence that some branches of textual tradition preserved in Alexandria were lost before they could influence the later canon. This loss is particularly striking in philosophical and scientific fields. Unique Alexandrian versions of key works, versions that might have preserved early formulations or alternative interpretations, vanished at some point between their acquisition and the later catalogues known to modern scholarship. The absence of these distinctive manuscripts underscores how easily specialized or variant traditions could disappear even within a world-class repository. A final piece completes this pattern. Records of international exchanges sometimes mention hybrid works, texts blending traditions from multiple cultures that reached Alexandria but are now untraceable. Scholars studying these references point out that such hybrid works often emerged from border regions where Greek, Babylonian, Persian, and Egyptian intellectual traditions interacted. These texts, combining divergent conceptual frameworks, offered unique perspectives on astronomy, medicine, or ritual practice. Their disappearance from the Alexandrian record is particularly notable because they represent moments of cultural synthesis central to the library's mission, yet none survive, either in the main collection or in the traces of the Serapeum. Historians suggest that these hybrid works may have been vulnerable precisely because they did not fit neatly into established categories. Their ambiguous status, neither fully Greek nor fully local, may have limited the enthusiasm of scribes tasked with copying them. In periods of upheaval, works not firmly anchored in institutional priorities were at heightened risk of being lost. When you bring these five currents together, the missing diplomatic gifts, the vanished correspondence, the untraceable foreign works, the lost variant versions, and the disappearance of hybrid cultural texts, you begin to see the library not as an unbroken vault, but as a porous, dynamic institution, shaped by exchanges that often left incomplete records. The gaps in these international flows reveal a vast network of lost relationships. They show how knowledge once passed between cultures, only for its traces to dissolve when political or institutional pressures interrupted the flow. This awareness leads naturally into the next phase of your investigation, the world of translation. If the library served as a crossroads of languages and traditions, then the act of translation became a crucial mechanism shaping what survived and what altered in transmission. And in the next section, the mysteries surrounding those translations reveal how many ideas may have existed only briefly, recorded, transformed, and then lost as quickly as they appeared. When you step into the realm of translation within the Library of Alexandria, you enter a space where texts did not simply move from one language to another, they transformed. Every translation was an interpretive act, shaped by choices, conventions, and assumptions that left subtle marks on the final product. The library's vast multilingual environment, Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic, and others, required constant negotiation between languages. Yet the deeper you explore these processes, the more you realize how many of the library's translations reveal contradictions, unexpected decisions, or underlying puzzles. The mystery is not only what was translated, but how, why, and into what forms those translations evolved. Your first encounter with this landscape emerges when ancient writers describe the Septuagint's commission under Ptolemaic patronage. According to traditional accounts, the translation of Hebrew scriptures into Greek was carried out by a group of scholars brought to Alexandria specifically for this purpose. Historians analyzing this process emphasize that the project required intimate knowledge of both linguistic traditions and interpretive frameworks. The result was a Greek text that became central to later Jewish and Christian traditions. Yet modern linguistic studies reveal that certain passages diverge from what later Hebrew manuscripts preserve. These divergences raise questions about the source texts used by the translators, the interpretive choices they made, and the cultural environment in which they worked. Some scholars argue that the translators were working with variant Hebrew traditions that have since disappeared. Others suggest that the team's philosophical and cultural assumptions influenced their decisions. In either case, the Septuagint becomes a window into an Alexandrian environment where translation did not simply transmit meaning, but reshaped it. As you follow these linguistic divergences, the second current becomes visible. Ancient sources describe translators in Alexandria struggling with terminology that had no direct equivalence in Greek. Fields like astronomy, medicine, and ritual practice depended on technical vocabularies deeply rooted in their original cultural contexts. When scribes attempted to render these concepts into Greek, they often faced terms that resisted simple conversion. Historians studying these translations note that scribes sometimes borrowed foreign words, sometimes created new Greek terms, and sometimes substituted approximations that only partially conveyed the original meaning. The resulting texts reveal traces of these decisions, borrowings, neologisms, or conceptual adaptations that indicate where translators encountered resistance. These linguistic challenges provide insight into a world where cross-cultural knowledge exchange required constant negotiation. They also explain why some translated works feel conceptually distant from their non-Greek originals. The transmission process involved not only linguistic conversion, but cultural reinterpretation. The third dimension of this section appears when you notice the presence of multiple versions of certain translated works circulating within Alexandria. Ancient commentators mention variant Greek versions of Egyptian religious texts, astronomical tables, and philosophical dialogues. Some variants seem to reflect differences in the source materials. Others suggest that translators revised or updated earlier translations. Historians examining these traditions highlight the dynamic interplay between written and oral knowledge in Alexandria. Translators sometimes relied on oral explanations from local experts, combining them with written sources to create hybrid texts. This process created layers of interpretation that could diverge significantly from one version to another. When you observe how these variants evolved, you begin to understand why certain Alexandrian translations appear inconsistent or contradictory. The phenomenon reflects not errors, but a complex environment where knowledge moved through multiple pathways, producing textual traditions that were fluid rather than fixed. This fluidity becomes even more striking when you reach the fourth and final element of this section: ancient references to translated works that no longer exist in any language. Scholars studying fragmentary citations find mentions of Greek versions of Egyptian or Near Eastern technical treatises that have disappeared entirely. These lost translations are especially intriguing because they would have provided access to traditions otherwise inaccessible to the Greek-speaking world. Some ancient astronomers refer to translated tables based on Egyptian observations. Philosophers mention interpretations of temple rituals conveyed through translated commentaries. Historians describe foreign records that had been rendered into Greek for cross-cultural comparison. Yet none of these works survive. Their disappearance suggests that the translation process did not guarantee preservation. Even when foreign ideas were rendered into Greek, they could be vulnerable, dependent on sustained interest, copying networks, and political stability to remain part of the library's holdings. The absence of these translated works reveals how fragile the transmission of cross-cultural knowledge could be, even within a center renowned for its intellectual ambition. When you bring these threads together, the divergences in the Septuagint, the struggles with technical terminology, the existence of variant translations, and the disappearance of entire bodies of translated work, you begin to see that translation in Alexandria was not a straightforward process. It was a complex, adaptive system shaped by linguistic challenges, cultural assumptions, and the availability of source materials. Translation created opportunities for cross-cultural understanding, but it also introduced distortions, omissions, and interpretive layers that complicate modern efforts to reconstruct ancient knowledge. The inconsistencies in these translations are not flaws. They are artifacts of a world where languages interacted at high speed and under immense pressure. This realization leads you toward the next stage of the library's mysteries, where the losses become even more tangible. If translated works could disappear, the fate of earlier manuals, the tools that guided translators, catalogers, and scholars, becomes even more uncertain. The question of how the library organized knowledge begins to fracture when you confront the possibility that even its internal instruments of classification have vanished. And it is exactly this growing uncertainty that draws you into the next section. As you move deeper into the machinery that once organized the library's vast holdings, the ground beneath the historical record begins to shift again. The idea that Alexandria preserved not only manuscripts but also the intellectual tools needed to understand them opens an entirely different realm of loss, one that is quieter than the disappearance of famous works, yet perhaps even more consequential. Catalogues, reference guides, analytical commentaries, and methodological manuals shaped how scholars navigated the library's shelves, interpreted texts, and connected ideas across disciplines. When you follow the traces of these vanished tools, you begin to grasp how thoroughly the ancient world depended on systems now lost. Without them, entire intellectual traditions become harder to reconstruct, and the library's internal logic dissolves into fragments. Your first encounter with this deeper erosion appears in references to pioneering catalogues created during the library's early centuries. Ancient writers describe how scholars like Callimachus and his successors produced vast bibliographic systems, organizing tens of thousands of scrolls by subject, author, genre, and format. These catalogues were not mere lists. They included biographical information, summaries of content, and critical remarks. They represented an intellectual infrastructure that allowed scholars to locate materials efficiently and evaluate their importance. Yet only fragments and secondary references survive. Historians studying these traces emphasize that the disappearance of such catalogues is not simply an archival loss. it undermines the ability to understand how the library functioned. Without the structure these catalogues provided, the surviving evidence of Alexandria's holdings becomes almost impossible to map. The absence reveals how much of the library's intellectual framework remains invisible. As you absorb the implications of this loss, the second current emerges in parallel. Ancient sources describe analytical commentaries once used to guide scholars through complex works, but these commentaries themselves survive only in scattered fragments or indirect references. These were the tools that helped readers navigate dense philosophical texts, advanced mathematical treatises, and intricate poetic compositions. Commentators explained arguments, clarified terminology, provided historical context, and highlighted interpretive controversies. Their presence indicates that ancient scholarship depended on a layered process of understanding, in which primary texts were inseparable from the explanatory traditions built around them. When these commentaries vanish, the primary works they once illuminated can appear opaque or incomplete. Historians note that many surviving texts feel disjointed precisely because the interpretive frameworks that originally accompanied them have dissolved. The result is a loss of intellectual continuity that complicates modern attempts to reconstruct ancient ideas. This erosion becomes even more apparent when you follow the third element, references to methodological treatises used by scholars working in the library. These treatises explained research procedures, classification systems, and analytical methods. They served as guides for cataloguers, scribes, and scholars who needed consistent standards for evaluating, preserving, and annotating materials. Some ancient testimonies describe how these methodological texts shaped the library's internal operations, providing models for textual criticism, historical analysis, and philological comparison. Yet none of these manuals survive in their original form. Historians can only infer their content from the practices reflected in surviving works. The disappearance of such methodological tools leaves a gap not only in understanding how the library functioned, but also in understanding the evolution of ancient scholarship itself. Without these guides, the intellectual map of the ancient Mediterranean becomes harder to trace. A fourth dimension comes into focus when you consider the loss of technical glossaries and reference works that once connected different fields of knowledge. Ancient writers mentioned glossaries of rare words, encyclopedic compilations of scientific terminology, and cross-referenced lists of philosophical concepts. These materials were essential for navigating a scholarly environment where texts from different cultures and disciplines interacted. Glossaries helped translators interpret foreign terms. Encyclopedic compilations offered standardized definitions. Cross-referenced lists facilitated interdisciplinary study. The disappearance of these tools reveals how much of the library's intellectual infrastructure has crumbled. Historians point out that without these reference works, modern scholars must attempt to reconstruct ancient terminology from limited sources, risking misinterpretation. The absence of such tools illustrates how deeply knowledge depends on the systems that support it, and how devastating the loss of those systems can be. The fifth and final thread of this section reveals the disappearance of comparative indexes that once linked related works across fields. Ancient scholars created indexes connecting texts on mathematics, astronomy, geography, medicine, and philosophy, enabling researchers to follow ideas across disciplines. These indexes were essential in a library as vast as Alexandria's, ensuring that scholars could trace themes, methods, and arguments across hundreds of scrolls. Some ancient authors mention using such indexes to develop comprehensive analyses or synthesize ideas from different traditions. Yet none of these indexes survive. Their absence creates a profound rupture in the understanding of how knowledge was interconnected in antiquity. Without them, the library's interdisciplinary richness becomes harder to perceive, and the pathways connecting different fields fade into obscurity. The loss of these comparative tools reshapes how modern scholars view ancient science and philosophy, obscuring the collaborative networks that once defined Alexandrian scholarship. When you bring these 5 strands together, the vanished catalogues, missing analytical commentaries, lost methodological treatises, absent technical glossaries, and destroyed comparative indexes, you begin to see the library not as a simple repository, but as an intellectual machine. It depended on a web of tools, systems, and interpretive traditions that enabled scholars to understand, classify, and integrate knowledge. The disappearance of these tools is perhaps the most profound loss of all. Without them, even the texts that survive are shadows of their former contexts. The library's intellectual architecture, its structure of understanding, has collapsed, leaving only isolated fragments where a coherent system once flourished. This realization leads you to the next layer of the mystery, where the question shifts from the tools of knowledge to the stories surrounding the library's destruction. The fires, conflicts, and political upheavals that damaged the institution are known through contradictory accounts, narratives that both illuminate and obscure the truth. To follow that trail, you must step into the contested history of what was destroyed, when, and by whom. As you step into the history of Alexandria's destruction narratives, you enter a uniquely tangled territory. Few chapters of ancient history have been shaped by so many contradictory accounts, later interpretations, ideological motivations, and retrospective simplifications. The library became a symbol long before it became a subject of sober analysis, and that symbolism often obscured the realities preserved in the historical record. When you examine what ancient authors actually wrote, you find not a single catastrophic event, but a series of disruptions, each one contributing to the erosion of the institution. The contradictions between these accounts form their own mystery, one that demands careful attention to the gaps, silences, and tensions shaping the story. Your first encounter with these contradictions emerges when ancient writers describe Julius Caesar's military actions in Alexandria. Commentators from the Roman era mention that a fire set to burn enemy ships spread to nearby buildings, damaging storage facilities associated with the library. Some authors describe this as a serious loss, noting the destruction of manuscripts housed in the harbour warehouses. Yet others downplay the extent of the damage, suggesting that the museum itself remained intact. Historians analysing these divergent accounts point out that the sources vary in proximity to the event and in their political motivations. Some writers sought to highlight the unintended consequences of Caesar's campaign. Others portrayed him as a reformer or minimised collateral damage for ideological reasons. The resulting tension leaves the scale of the loss uncertain. What becomes clear is that the event did not fit neatly into a single narrative. It did, however, mark a turning point that revealed the vulnerability of the library's external storage facilities. Their partial destruction underscores how knowledge could be lost, not through a dramatic final blaze, but through the slow accumulation of crises. As you follow these early disruptions, a second current emerges, with equal complexity. Later accounts attribute significant destruction to the wars and conflicts that engulfed the city during the Roman and post-Roman periods. Writers from late antiquity describe episodes in which factions battled within the city, threatening its cultural infrastructure. In some narratives, the library is depicted as a casualty of these conflicts. In others, the damage is attributed instead to administrative neglect or budgetary collapse. Historians studying these contradictory testimonies emphasize that the chroniclers often wrote generations after the events they described, drawing on local traditions, rumor, or ideological positions, rather than direct evidence. This distance amplifies uncertainty. Some accounts frame the losses as part of a broader decline in urban administration. Others attribute them to the struggles between Roman authorities and local factions. The inconsistencies illustrate how the library's decline cannot be reduced to a single moment, but rather reflects a series of shocks that accumulated over time. The third layer of contradiction appears when you encounter descriptions linking destruction to religious conflict. Late antique authors describe periods of intense tension within Alexandria, particularly between emerging Christian authorities and traditional pagan institutions. In some narratives, the library, or its associated institutions, appear as symbolic battlegrounds, yet the details vary significantly. Certain writers claim that religious disputes endangered collections housed in the museum's precincts. Others focus solely on the Serapeum, noting that its destruction represented a broader cultural rupture. Modern historians caution that many of these accounts must be read critically. Some were written to advance polemical positions rather than provide objective history. The contradictory nature of these narratives makes it difficult to determine the precise extent of the damage inflicted by religious conflicts. What does emerge consistently is that Alexandria experienced intense ideological upheaval that placed intellectual institutions at risk. The fluctuating accounts highlight how different groups sought to interpret the fate of the library in ways that reflected their own political or theological agendas. A fourth and final contradiction in this section reveals itself when you examine classical references describing how the library's collections were gradually dispersed. Ancient authors occasionally mention manuscripts being transferred, displaced, or repurposed in ways that reflect shifting institutional priorities. These fragmentary remarks indicate that the library's holdings did not vanish instantaneously. They were relocated, reorganized, or abandoned as political and cultural conditions changed. In some cases, manuscripts appear to have been moved to regional institutions or private collections. In other cases, they may have been repurposed during administrative reforms or lost through mundane processes such as decay or relocation. Historians note that this gradual dispersal complicates the dramatic narratives often associated with the library's destruction. It implies that the institution's decline was not solely the result of fire or violent conflict, but also of the slow erosion of support structures, funding, copying networks, trained personnel, and stable governance. This more gradual interpretation stands in tension with the stories of sudden catastrophe, embodying yet another contradiction within the historical record. When you bring these four strands together, the conflicting accounts of Caesar's fire, the contradictory narratives surrounding wars and civic unrest, the ideologically charged descriptions of religious conflict, and the fragmentary evidence of gradual dispersal, you begin to see why the story of the library's destruction remains so elusive. Each account reflects the perspective, priorities, and limitations of its author. None provide a complete or definitive picture. The contradictions do not merely represent confusion, they reveal a world where history was shaped as much by narrative needs as by factual detail. The library became a symbol of lost knowledge long before historians attempted to piece together its actual fate. As a result, the narratives that survive must be interpreted not as straightforward reports, but as expressions of broader cultural, political, and ideological currents. This uncertainty leads you toward the next phase of the investigation, where the focus shifts to what later eras believed had been lost. Medieval and early modern writers preserved their own lists of vanished texts, works they claimed once existed in Alexandria but disappeared over time. These lists, though often speculative, illuminate how successive generations imagined the scale and nature of the library's losses. To understand how the idea of disappearance evolved, you now move into the realm of later traditions, where memory and myth intertwine with the historical record. When you step into the traditions that took shape long after Alexandria's greatest centuries had passed, you find yourself navigating a landscape where memory and imagination intertwine. Medieval and early modern writers often described the library's losses with vivid certainty, even when their claims rested on fragments, conjectures, or inherited stories, rather than documented facts. These traditions matter because they reveal how later cultures perceived the library's significance, what they believed had vanished, what they mourned, and what they feared had been erased forever. As you follow these narratives, you begin to see how the idea of the library's destruction became a canvas onto which every era projected its anxieties about the fragility of knowledge. Your first encounter with these traditions emerges from medieval lists of lost books attributed to the library. Writers from the Islamic Golden Age, Byzantine scholars, and later European humanists occasionally compiled inventories of works they believed had once been housed in Alexandria, but no longer existed. These lists often included treatises on philosophy, astronomy, engineering, and religion. Historians analyzing these inventories note that many titles cannot be traced to any surviving catalogues, and some appear to be speculative extrapolations rather than documented losses. Yet the persistence of these lists reveals something significant. Later scholars felt compelled to imagine the magnitude of what had vanished. Their reconstructions reflect the belief that the library had contained the pinnacle of ancient knowledge, and that its destruction represented an unparalleled cultural tragedy. Even when the details lack firm historical grounding, the impulse to catalogue the missing suggests a collective recognition of an intellectual void. As you move deeper into this tradition, a second current emerges. Medieval writers frequently cited specific authors or works they believed had disappeared due to Alexandria's decline, even when no direct evidence linked those texts to the library. Islamic scholars, for example, sometimes described ancient Greek works on mechanics, optics, or medicine as casualties of the library's destruction, even though those fields continued in other manuscript traditions. European humanists later did the same, attributing the loss of certain classical works to Alexandria as a way of emphasizing the library's symbolic role as the guardian of antiquity. Historians studying these claims point out that they often reveal more about the writer's concerns than about actual events. When a text was known to be missing, it became tempting to tie its disappearance to the most famous loss in intellectual history. This retroactive attribution transformed the library into a focal point for explaining the gaps in ancient literature. The pattern underscores how the library served not only as a historical institution, but as a metaphor for the precariousness of cultural memory. You see this metaphor gaining further complexity when you turn to a third dimension. Early modern scholars used the library's imagined losses to frame debates about the preservation of knowledge in their own time. Renaissance humanists, confronting fragile manuscript traditions and the uncertainty of transmission, invoked Alexandria as a cautionary tale. They argued that without systematic preservation, their own intellectual heritage might meet a similar fate. In some cases, they compiled lists of works they believed had once existed in Alexandria to highlight the stakes of their efforts. These reconstructions were not based on archaeological or textual evidence. They were projections shaped by fears of cultural decline. Historians examining this trend note how often these early modern narratives exaggerated the scale of the library's holdings, portraying it as containing virtually every significant work of antiquity. While this portrayal lacks strict historical accuracy, it reveals the deep symbolic power the library had acquired. For later scholars, the imagined losses served as reminders of the vulnerability of knowledge and the responsibility to protect it. The fourth and final thread in this section becomes visible when you follow the influence of these traditions on modern perceptions of the library. Contemporary discussions of the library often draw, consciously or not, on medieval and early modern assumptions. The belief that entire scientific traditions vanished solely because of Alexandria's decline reflects the inheritance of centuries of speculation rather than the evidence preserved in ancient sources. Historians analyzing these modern portrayals emphasize that they often rely on narratives developed long after the library's fall, narratives shaped by ideological concerns, romanticization, or the desire to find a single moment that explains the fragility of human knowledge. This influence has created a persistent mythic image of the library as an irreplaceable repository whose loss halted the progress of science for centuries. While the destruction of the library certainly contributed to the disappearance of many works, the idea that it alone caused the collapse of ancient knowledge simplifies a far more complex historical reality. The modern fascination with this narrative shows how deeply the symbolic weight of Alexandria's disappearance has penetrated cultural memory. When you bring these four currents together, the medieval lists of vanished works, the retroactive attribution of losses to Alexandria, the early modern use of the library as a cautionary symbol, and the shaping of modern narratives by these traditions, you begin to see how the library's legend evolved long after the physical institution had faded. The stories preserved in medieval and early modern texts do not provide reliable inventories of what was lost. Instead, they reveal how each era understood the stakes of preservation. For medieval scholars, the library represented a vanished world of wisdom. For Renaissance thinkers, it became a warning. For modern audiences, it embodies both a tragedy and a lesson about the fragility of intellectual systems. This evolving mythology leads you naturally toward the next stage of the investigation, where the emphasis shifts from lists of vanished works to the political forces that shaped the library's environment during its final centuries. If later traditions reconstructed what was lost according to cultural imagination, the next section explores how the shifting political landscape of the late Roman world shaped what was preserved, overlooked, or allowed to disappear. When you turn toward the political environment that shaped Alexandria in its later centuries, you find a city navigating pressures far different from those of its Hellenistic Golden Age. The library's fate cannot be understood without tracing how shifting administrative structures, regional crises, and changing imperial priorities reshaped the intellectual landscape. What survives from this period comes from historians who witnessed or were close to the transformation of the Roman world. Their accounts reveal a pattern not of sudden collapse, but of slow reorientation, periods when the preservation of knowledge was eclipsed by more urgent concerns. As you study these transitions, the library's decline begins to appear less as a singular catastrophe and more as the consequence of political realignments that steadily eroded the conditions necessary for scholarship to thrive. Your first glimpse of this gradual transformation appears in descriptions of administrative turbulence affecting Roman Egypt. Ancient writers note how the governance of Alexandria became increasingly unstable during the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, with rapid changes in authority, fluctuating tax burdens, and periodic civic unrest. These disruptions created an environment in which institutions dependent on sustained patronage found themselves vulnerable. Historians analyzing the political records emphasize that intellectual centers, such as the museum, required stable funding, consistent oversight, and carefully managed copying networks. When political leadership shifted repeatedly, these needs were often neglected. As the Roman administration responded to regional crises, including threats along the eastern frontier, internal power struggles, and economic strain, the resources once devoted to maintaining cultural institutions were redirected. The result was not an intentional dismantling of the library, but a gradual weakening of the support structures that had sustained it. As you observe these administrative shifts, the second current becomes clear. Certain Roman officials expressed concern about maintaining scholarly institutions during periods of crisis, but lacked the ability to act comprehensively. Some imperial correspondences refer to the importance of preserving Alexandria's intellectual heritage, yet these statements often appear in the context of broader appeals for stability. Historians studying these documents point out that the officials making these remarks were aware of the library's symbolic value, but their capacity to implement reforms was limited by pressing military and economic needs. These scattered expressions of concern reveal a tension between aspiration and reality. The governing class recognized the importance of scholarship, yet the institutional mechanisms required to protect it had weakened. The references underscore how fragile the library had become, admired in principle, but increasingly neglected in practice. The fragility becomes even more visible when you follow the third thread. During periods of external conflict and internal division, the city's priorities shifted away from scholarly preservation. Ancient sources describe how the Roman Empire, in its later centuries, faced challenges from multiple fronts: political fragmentation, territorial threats, and religious transformation. In times of crisis, cities like Alexandria focused on immediate survival rather than long-term intellectual stewardship. Historians reconstructing this period emphasize how such pressures contributed to the deterioration of infrastructure essential for maintaining large manuscript collections. Activities such as repairing storage facilities, training scribes, procuring writing materials, and cataloging holdings required both stability and funding. When these conditions changed, the intellectual institutions that had once flourished began to struggle. The shift in priorities did not erase the library at once, but it weakened the systems that allowed it to preserve knowledge on a grand scale. As you follow these pressures, a fourth dimension begins to take shape. During late antiquity, emerging political and ideological centers drew attention and resources away from Alexandria. New capitals such as Constantinople increasingly became focal points for imperial investment in cultural and scholarly institutions. Historians examining the patterns of resource allocation note that emperors and regional governors often preferred to support institutions closer to the centers of political power. While Alexandria retained its significance as a commercial and religious center, its role as a preeminent intellectual hub diminished. Scholars who once might have traveled to the museum now found patronage elsewhere. This shift in intellectual geography did not destroy the library outright, but it contributed to a decline in its prestige and its ability to attract talent. Over time, this redirection of support created a vacuum that undermined the institution's long-term viability. The fifth and final thread of this political landscape becomes clear when you turn to ancient accounts describing how administrative reforms may have prompted the reorganization or redistribution of manuscript collections. Historians analyzing fragmentary evidence note instances where documents, archives, or scholarly materials were relocated during administrative restructuring. These reorganizations were not always documented in detail, but they reflect a pattern of shifting institutional priorities. Some manuscripts may have been moved to regional archives, others to church institutions or private collections. The dispersal was not necessarily destructive, but it fractured the unity that had once defined the library's mission. In an environment marked by political change, such reorganizations could easily lead to losses, whether through misplacement, neglect, or lack of proper copying. The disappearance of portions of the collection thus becomes less a story of deliberate destruction and more a reflection of an unstable administrative system struggling to maintain coherence. When you bring these 5 elements together, the instability of late Roman administration, the limited capacity of officials to preserve scholarly institutions, the shift in priorities during periods of crisis, the redirection of cultural support toward new centers, and the reorganization of manuscript collections during administrative reforms, you begin to see the library's decline in a new light. It was not solely the result of dramatic events, but of structural changes that eroded the foundations upon which Alexandria's intellectual greatness had rested. The library depended on stability, patronage, and continuity. Without these, even the most magnificent repository of knowledge could falter. This understanding leads directly into the next stage of your investigation. If political realignment contributed to the slow erosion of the library's infrastructure, another force, ecclesiastical influence, shaped which works survived, which were neglected, and which disappeared entirely. To grasp the final centuries of the library's transformation, you must now trace how ecclesiastical policy interacted with ancient manuscript traditions, and how the rise of new intellectual authorities reshaped Alexandria's scholarly inheritance. When you turn toward the ecclesiastical forces that shaped Alexandria in its final centuries, you move into a world where intellectual authority was increasingly intertwined with religious leadership. The rise of Christian institutions did not automatically mean opposition to classical learning. Many bishops were trained in rhetoric, philosophy, and textual scholarship. Yet the priorities of ecclesiastical institutions differed from those of the museum, and the shift in authority created new patterns of preservation and neglect. As you follow the traces left behind, you begin to see how the fate of certain manuscripts was determined not only by political pressures, but also by the evolving structures of religious administration, which guided what was copied, which traditions were maintained, and which were quietly left behind. Your first glimpse of this transformation appears when historians examine how ecclesiastical leadership in late antiquity favored the preservation of certain genres of knowledge. Christian authorities often encouraged the copying of works useful for education, scriptural interpretation, or theological debate, while materials considered less relevant to the needs of the church received less attention. This shift did not necessarily reflect hostility toward classical scholarship. Many bishops promoted literacy and learning within their communities, but the priorities differed from those that had shaped the museum. Philosophical systems once central to Alexandria's identity were no longer the primary focus. Scientific works unrelated to calendrical calculation or medical care received less institutional support. Over time, this selective approach created an imbalance in preservation. The copying networks that had once sustained a vast range of disciplines contracted in scope, narrowing the intellectual ecosystem. The result was not the deliberate destruction of classical learning, but an inherited pattern of survival shaped by practical ecclesiastical needs. As you observe this narrowing of focus, the second current becomes visible. Ecclesiastical institutions, sometimes influenced, which manuscripts were relocated, consolidated, or incorporated into emerging church libraries. Ancient sources describe periods when collections from disused or declining scholarly institutions were transferred to ecclesiastical centers for safekeeping. These transfers reflected a desire to preserve material deemed valuable, but they also reshaped the context in which texts were read. Historians, analyzing these movements, note that when manuscripts entered church libraries, they were often reclassified according to theological or pedagogical priorities. Texts that aligned with ecclesiastical concerns were integrated into educational programs. Those that did not were stored without active copying, making them vulnerable to decay. The reorganization of collections thus created conditions in which entire intellectual traditions could fade simply because they no longer occupied a central place in institutional life. This process of absorption and reinterpretation marks a significant shift in Alexandria's cultural landscape. You see the implications of this shift more sharply when you encounter the third dimension. Ecclesiastical authorities occasionally discouraged the use of certain texts deemed incompatible with doctrinal integrity. Historians emphasize that such discouragement did not always involve prohibition. More often it took the form of rhetorical critique, moral caution, or pedagogical preference. Works promoting philosophical positions considered misleading, speculative, or spiritually hazardous were sometimes deemed unsuitable for general instruction. In such cases, manuscripts could be set aside rather than actively maintained. Over generations, this passive form of neglect produced significant effects. Materials that required careful copying to survive, especially technical works or texts demanding specialized knowledge, were among the first to deteriorate. This pattern does not indicate a systematic campaign against classical thought, but reveals how doctrinal concerns shaped what communities considered worth preserving. When intellectual traditions intersect with religious priorities, survival often reflects which materials feel necessary, safe, or beneficial within that evolving framework. The fourth and final thread in this section becomes clear when you consider how ecclesiastical transformation affected the physical spaces associated with scholarship. As Christian institutions gained prominence, some traditional centers of learning lost their administrative autonomy or were incorporated into broader networks of ecclesiastical oversight. Ancient writers describe how changes in governance influenced the resources available for maintaining manuscript collections. Buildings dedicated to older scholarly activities were repurposed, renovated, or abandoned depending on the needs of the community. Historians studying the patterns of urban change emphasize that these transformations often resulted in the relocation or dispersal of manuscripts. Texts once housed in the museum or associated libraries might be moved to smaller church collections or private archives, where their long-term survival depended on limited copying activity. The shifting physical landscape thus played a significant role in determining which materials endured. The disappearance of certain works reflects not an act of destruction, but a reorientation of urban and institutional priorities. When you bring these four strands together, the selective focus of ecclesiastical preservation, the reorganization of manuscript collections into church libraries, the discouragement of texts at odds with doctrinal concerns, and the repurposing of scholarly spaces, you begin to see how the intellectual environment transformed as Alexandria moved deeper into late antiquity. The library's heritage did not vanish abruptly. It was filtered through new systems of authority that valued some parts of the classical tradition while allowing others to wither. The shape of what survives today reflects these choices. Works central to Christian education or compatible with evolving theological frameworks often endured, while those requiring specialized training or supporting outdated philosophical systems faced increasing neglect. The resulting record reveals a landscape shaped not by destruction alone, but by the complex interplay of continuity and change within Alexandria's religious and administrative structures. This understanding opens the path to the next stage of the investigation, where the focus shifts from institutions and political currents to the manuscripts themselves, their material fragility, the environmental challenges they faced, and the quiet processes through which entire collections may have vanished without a trace. To follow that trail, you now turn from the decisions of human institutions to the forces capable of eroding even the most carefully curated texts. As you shift your focus from institutions and ideological currents to the manuscripts themselves, you begin to see the library's story from an entirely different angle. Human decisions shaped what was copied, shelved, or relocated, but the physical materials also lived under pressures no curator could fully control. The fragility of ancient writing surfaces, the vulnerability of ink, the dependence on environmental conditions, these forces quietly determined what could endure, shaping the contours of survival long before dramatic conflicts left their marks. When you observe the interplay between material decay and incomplete maintenance, you start to understand how much of Alexandria's loss stemmed not from fire alone, but from the slow, persistent effects of time, climate, and imperfect preservation. Your first glimpse of this deeper vulnerability appears when historians analyze the construction of early scrolls housed in the library. Papyrus, the primary writing surface of antiquity, offered an efficient and accessible medium, but it carried an inherent fragility. Ancient authors themselves sometimes noted how papyrus deteriorated under humidity, temperature fluctuation, or repeated handling. Modern scholars examining surviving fragments confirm that papyrus fibers weaken over decades, becoming brittle or discolored, and eventually breaking down. In Alexandria's climate, warm, humid, and sometimes exposed to seawater air, these effects were magnified. Preservation required optimal storage conditions, regular inspection, and careful copying. Yet evidence from ancient sources suggests that even in well-managed archives, deterioration was constant. The mere passage of time posed a challenge that demanded sustained effort. The existence of thousands of scrolls only intensified the pressure. No institution, however dedicated, could prevent every manuscript from succumbing to this slow erosion. As you follow this thread, the second current becomes clearer. Ancient references describe how some scrolls were already damaged, faded, or requiring restoration during the library's active centuries. Historians interpret these comments as signs that the library conducted repairs, but not always at the pace needed to cover its vast holdings. Restoring fragile manuscripts required skilled labor, specialized tools, and ample time. Scribes and conservators needed to unravel damaged portions, reapply adhesive, realign fibers, and sometimes transfer text to new scrolls. Yet Alexandria's collections were immense, containing tens or even hundreds of thousands of manuscripts across multiple sites. Ancient descriptions of fading ink or crumbling papyrus imply that some works were placed in line for restoration but did not receive immediate attention. Over years, such delays could mean irreversible loss. The pattern underscores a sobering reality. Even without external destruction, the library faced a continuous battle against the natural decay of its materials, a battle that could not always be won. This vulnerability becomes even more striking when you examine the third dimension of material disappearance: environmental hazards that affected scroll longevity. Alexandria, situated near the Mediterranean coast, was exposed to fluctuations in humidity and temperature that could accelerate papyrus degradation. Historians examining environmental data note that moisture can cause ink to run, fibers to swell or separate, and entire layers of scrolls to fuse together. Rodents, insects, and mold presented additional threats, especially in storage rooms where circulation was limited. While the library undoubtedly implemented measures to protect its holdings, ancient references to manuscript damage suggest that such hazards remained persistent. A flood, a leaking roof, or a period of unusually damp weather could compromise hundreds of scrolls at once. Even minor structural damage in storage areas might introduce vulnerabilities that grew over time. The material record makes clear that environmental pressures posed risks that a single fire could not account for. They operated quietly, gradually, and relentlessly. As you consider the cumulative effect of these environmental forces, the fourth and final strand emerges. Scholars note that some scrolls likely vanished long before the library's final decline, simply because they were not recopied in time. Manuscript cultures depended on continuous reproduction. A text remained alive only if it continued to be transcribed. If it ceased to circulate or fell out of use, it faced a natural end. This dynamic means that some works disappeared not because they were destroyed, but because they slowly detached from the active scholarly ecosystem. When intellectual trends shifted, when priorities changed, or when copying activity decreased, texts could fall into disuse. Without regular transcription, scrolls inevitably decayed. Historians studying the transmission of ancient literature emphasize that even major works risked extinction when the infrastructure supporting their reproduction weakened. In Alexandria, moments of political or administrative disruption, however brief, could interrupt copying cycles long enough for delicate scrolls to deteriorate beyond recovery. The resulting losses reflect a subtle but powerful mechanism: disappearance through neglect rather than catastrophe. When you bring these four strands together, the inherent fragility of papyrus, the backlog of restoration needs, the environmental pressures of Alexandria's climate, and the quiet disappearance of works not recopied in time, you begin to see how vulnerable the library's collections truly were. Even in peaceful conditions, preservation demanded constant vigilance. Any interruption in copying, restoration, or storage maintenance could have irreversible consequences. The scrolls that survived did so thanks to sustained effort, but those that vanished often did so inch by inch, fiber by fiber, long before any dramatic event left its mark on history. This understanding brings you toward the final turn of the investigation. The library's losses were shaped by political pressures, ideological conflicts, environmental challenges, and material fragility. But the final section brings all these threads together into a single unresolved question of everything that disappeared. Which losses stand as the most consequential, the most mysterious, the most haunting? To approach that question, you now move toward the culmination of the archive, the final set of forbidden mysteries that scholars still struggle to illuminate. When you reach the final constellation of mysteries surrounding the Library of Alexandria, you are standing before questions that cannot be resolved by catalogues, archaeological reports, or surviving scraps of text. These are the persistent uncertainties that continue to shape modern scholarship, the unresolved enigmas that define the library's legacy. They arise not because historians lack interest or skill, but because the evidence itself has fractured, leaving behind shards that point in multiple directions. As you examine these last haunting threads, the story of the library becomes not merely a tale of loss, but a meditation on the limits of historical knowledge. What remains are contradictions, ambiguities, and absences that resist definitive explanation. Your first encounter with these unresolved mysteries comes when historians analyze conflicting accounts about how the library's collections were organized in its final centuries. Ancient authors describe the library and the Serapeum as separate yet related institutions, but the precise relationship between their holdings remains unclear. Some texts imply that the Serapeum acted as a secondary or overflow library. Others suggest it held independent collections tied to religious functions. Because the surviving evidence is fragmentary, scholars cannot determine how manuscripts were divided, duplicated, or shared between the sites. This uncertainty complicates attempts to reconstruct the library's final state. It also reveals how political and administrative changes may have reshaped the institution's internal structure in ways that left no visible trace. You are left with a sense of an organization that evolved continuously, yet without leaving behind the documentation needed to understand its final form. As you delve deeper into this ambiguity, a second unresolved question emerges: whether certain bodies of knowledge preserved in Alexandria were ever fully catalogued or even intended for public scholarly use. Ancient sources occasionally reference collections that may have been maintained separately from the main holdings. Restricted archives, private manuscript rooms, or specialized research chambers meant for advanced study. Yet no surviving catalogue mentions these materials explicitly. Historians attempting to trace the existence of such collections confront a void, relying on indirect references or brief comments buried in unrelated works. This uncertainty reflects the complexity of Alexandria's intellectual environment. Some knowledge may have circulated only among select scholars, preserved in limited copies that were never widely copied or distributed. If such materials existed, their disappearance leaves questions not only about what was lost, but about how much of the library's intellectual landscape remains invisible to modern eyes. A third unresolved mystery takes shape when scholars examine contradictory reports about the timing and nature of the library's final losses. Ancient narratives differ widely. Some describe catastrophic destruction tied to specific historical events. Others suggest a gradual erosion that continued for centuries. Historians analyzing these accounts note how each writer's perspective, political affiliation, or religious orientation shaped their portrayal of events. Some attributed losses to military conflict, others to ideological hostility, and still others to administrative neglect. The absence of contemporary, detailed documentation makes it impossible to identify which account reflects the actual sequence of events. This uncertainty leaves modern scholarship in a position of careful speculation. The truth may lie in a combination of these narratives, or in circumstances that were never recorded. The ambiguity becomes part of the library's enduring mystique, a symbol not only of what was lost, but of what cannot be fully known. The final and most haunting unresolved mystery emerges when you consider the vast number of works referenced in ancient literature that have no surviving trace. Historians estimate that thousands of titles mentioned by classical authors have vanished completely, leaving behind only brief summaries, passing remarks, or echoes in later interpretations. Some of these works were almost certainly part of Alexandria's collections. Others may have existed elsewhere. The challenge is that the absence of manuscripts prevents scholars from determining which intellectual traditions depended on Alexandrian preservation. When ancient authors cite works now lost, they offer glimpses into a world of thought far broader than the surviving record suggests. These glimpses raise profound questions. How many scientific theories, philosophical arguments, or historical narratives disappeared before later scholars could interpret them? How many disciplines developed along lines shaped not by the best available knowledge, but by whatever happened to survive? The scale of these unknowns transforms the library's story into something larger than a historical narrative. It becomes a reflection on the fragility of understanding itself. When you bring these four unresolved questions together, the ambiguity of the library's final structure, the uncertain status of restricted collections, the conflicting destruction narratives, and the vast shadow of irretrievable works, you arrive at a point where scholarship meets its limits. What survives of Alexandria's legacy is substantial, but what does not survive is immeasurable. The library was not simply a building or a collection. It was a living network of ideas, constantly evolving through the choices of scholars, scribes, rulers, and communities. Its disappearance cannot be captured by any single narrative or explained by any singular event. Instead, it reflects a complex interplay of preservation and loss that spans centuries. As you stand here at the end of the archive, the mysteries still unresolved illuminate why Alexandria holds such power in cultural memory. Its story is not defined solely by what was destroyed, but by what remains unknown, by the intellectual horizons that once existed but now lie beyond recovery. The unanswered questions become a mirror, reflecting the precariousness of all knowledge and the delicate systems upon which its survival depends. These final enigmas do not close the story. They leave it open, inviting scholars to continue the search, to interpret the fragments and to confront the limits of the historical record with humility.